trust with local communities. So it is possible, and I'm very heartened by the progress that I'm seeing around the country.
That completes the statements. Those who wish to leave, please do so. Right, we come to the next statement. I call the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack.
Mr. Speaker, today I will make an order under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998, preventing the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill from proceeding to royal assent. This order will mean the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament will not submit the bill for royal assent. This government believes, however, that transgender people deserve our respect, our support and our understanding. My decision is centred on the legislation's consequences for the operation of reserved matters, including equality legislation across Scotland, England and Wales. The Scottish Government's bill would introduce a new process for applying for legal gender recognition in Scotland. The changes include reducing the minimum age a person can apply for a gender recognition certificate from 18 to 16 and removing the need for a medical diagnosis and evidence of having lived for 2 years in their acquired gender. The bill would amend the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which legislated for a single gender recognition system across the United Kingdom and which received a legislative consent motion from the Scottish Parliament. The approach taken in the Scottish Government's Gender Recognition Reform Bill was the subject of intense debate in the Scottish Parliament. A number of significant amendments were tabled right up until the end of the bill's passage, and the Minister for Women and Equalities corresponded with and met with the Cabinet Secretary Shona Robertson to discuss the UK Government's concerns before the bill had reached its final stage. Mr. Speaker, I have not taken this decision lightly. The Government has looked closely at the potential impact of the bill, and I have considered all relevant policy and operational implications together with the Minister for Women and Equalities. And it is our assessment that the bill would have a serious adverse impact, among other things, on the operation of the Equality Act 2010. Those adverse effects include impacts on the operation of single-sex clubs, associations and schools, and protections such as equal pay. The Government shares the concerns of many members of the public and civic society groups regarding the potential impact of the bill on women and girls. The bill also risks creating significant complications from having two different gender recognition regimes in the UK and allowing more fraudulent or bad faith applications. The Government is today publishing a full statement of reasons alongside the order, which will set in full the adverse effects the Government is concerned about. Mr. Speaker, I would like to address the claims put forward by those who would seek to politicise this decision and claim that this is some kind of constitutional outrage. And you can hear them, Mr. Speaker, you can hear them. The Section 35 power was included in the Scotland Act, which established the Scottish Parliament. This is the first time the power has been exercised, and I acknowledge that this is a significant decision. The powers of Section 35 of the Scotland Act are not new, and this Government has not created them. They have existed as long as devolution itself. And we should be clear that the power was included in the Act by the architects of the devolution for a reason. Donald Dewar himself noted that the power struck an important balance. The Section 35 power provides a sensible measure to ensure that devolved legislation does not have adverse impacts on reserved matters, including on the equalities legislation such as the Equality Act 2010. This is not about preventing the Scottish Parliament from legislating on devolved matters, but about ensuring that we do not have legal frameworks in one part of the United Kingdom which have adverse effects on reserved matters. And we should be clear that this is absolutely not about the United Kingdom Government being able to veto Scottish Parliament legislation whenever it chooses, as some have implied. The power can only be exercised on specific grounds, and the fact that this is the first time it has been necessary to exercise the power in almost 25 years of devolution emphasises that it is not a power to be used lightly. In the instance of the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill, I have concluded that the bill would have serious adverse effects on the operation of the Equality Act 2010, and as I've set out in my correspondence with the First Minister yesterday, I would prefer not to be in this situation. The United Kingdom Government does all we can to respect the devolution settlement and to resolve disputes. It is open to the Scottish Government to bring back an amended bill for reconsideration in the Scottish Parliament. So to conclude, Mr Speaker, I have set out to the Scottish Government that should they choose to do so, I hope we can work together to find a constructive way forward that both respects devolution and the operation of the United Kingdom Parliament legislation, and I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement? This is an incredibly serious moment. It's the first time Section 35 has been invoked. Donald Dewar has already been mentioned, the father of devolution, of course, designed Section 35 to protect devolution. It was passed by all parties in this House and hasn't been objected to since. It was intended not as a blocking mechanism, but an enabling mechanism, so that the Scottish Parliament could pass legislation and devolve competencies without changing reserved functions. There was concern at the time by colleagues of the Secretary of State that this could be used as a veto. So a memorandum of understanding was agreed. It said, and I quote, "Although the UK Government is prepared to use these powers if necessary, it sees them as very much a matter of last resort. The UK Government and the administration concerned will therefore aim to resolve any difficulties through discussion so as to avoid any action or omission by the devolved administration having an adverse impact on non-devolved matters." So can I ask the Secretary of State, is this a last resort? Has the Secretary of State had extensive discussions with the Scottish Government before taking this action? No. How many times has the Secretary of State met with the Scottish Government before the bill was passed, during its debate in Holyrood and since its passage? It appears to me that this has only become a last resort in terms of the legal timing because both governments can't and won't work with each other. Yeah. The Secretary of State says that Section 35 is being used, among other reasons, in relation to the Equality Act. Both the Scotland Act and the Equality Act are landmark pieces of Labour legislation, establishing devolution and enshrining rights to be free of discrimination in law. Nobody has to question this party's commitment to equality. We passed the initial GRA, we brought in the Disability Discrimination Act, and we got the world-leading Equality Act into law. But clearly, there's a need for laws passed by Holyrood and those by Westminster to interact. And in this case, the trans community need that cross-border interaction to work. Part of the reason that after 25 years of devolution, Section 35 has never been exercised is largely because of the way devolution was set up and intended to operate. Governments with their own agendas, but with a common purpose, working together to serve the Scottish people. Now Scotland is saddled with an administration in Edinburgh that's hell-bent on breaking devolution and a Conservative administration here in London that's intent on ignoring it. Indeed, the Secretary of State seems to spend more time with government lawyers to stop things happening rather than make them work, and the Scottish Government is spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on lawyers challenging laws they know are unchallengeable in order to manufacture political grievance. And in this case, it's the public who are let down. Trans people who suffer intense discrimination will now not see this legislation take effect anytime soon, if at all, and women's rights groups who will likely not see their concerns addressed or their fears alleviated because this simple truth is that this has turned into a constitutional bun fight. Yeah. I would also suggest that the SNP would be rightly screaming, and they are doing today and would do so in the past, if a piece of legislation passed in this place had implications for default competencies. They would challenge that, and they would rightly challenge that, as is their right. And if we are to accept the argument from the Scottish Government that there is no effect on the Equality Act, then the courts will surely strike out this Section 35 action, as we believe the Scottish Government will take it to court. Mr Speaker, can I also ask the Secretary of State, Scottish Labour got the primacy of the Equality Act on the face of the Gender Recognition Bill. Will the statutory instrument that he detailed in his statement give the details of where he thinks it is incompatible? Yes. The Secretary of State said last night there was a version of this Act which the UK Government could support. So what does that look like? But he says in his statement there are complications with two different gender regimes. Is he saying the Scottish Parliament shouldn't have the competence? As the bill was debated in Holyrood, was it not obvious to him and to his colleagues that it could contravene reserved law? What did he do about it then? During the passage of the bill, Scottish Labour made clear that if the bill was to work, clear guidance was required. The SNP Scottish Government said it was for the Equality and Human Rights Commission to provide such guidance, not them as the government. Why doesn't the Secretary of State instruct the EHRC to provide that guidance, look at the cross-border issues he mentions, and provide recommendations as to the interaction of the Equality Act? Both governments should commit to accepting those conclusions. Or is the Secretary of State saying that the ball is only in the Scottish Government's court to bring back amended legislation, and he now backs out of the process. Mr Speaker, we support the principle of updating the GRA, which when the Labour Government introduced in 2004 was world-leading, but 2 decades on now requires modernisation to humanise and to remove the indignities in this dreadful process. We've ended up in a legal and constitutional impasse. My final question to the Secretary of State is, what is he going to do to resolve it?
Well, Mr Speaker, to answer his questions hopefully in the right order, it is not a last resort. To understand the Scotland Act, the Section 33 is where the UK legislation is directly changed, and Section 35 is when it's adversely affected. And we have 28 days to make a decision in either case before the legislation goes for royal assent. And in this case, the legal test that has been given to us and proved by our officials is one of Section 35, which is adverse effect on on 2 parts of UK/GB legislation. So that's where we're at. We have 28 days to make that decision, and we have to make a decision in that time frame. And in this case, this very senior legal opinion advises us that a Section 35 is appropriate. And we will see that in my statement of reasons, which we have laid with the order. On his second point, officials have been meeting with officials in the Scottish Government since the bill was introduced. And the Minister for Gender and Equalities wrote, after the second stage, wrote to the Bill Minister expressing her concerns and asking for a meeting, and that meeting took place, and again, her concerns were expressed at that meeting. Regarding the EHRC, the EHRC have said that they're willing to work with and support the Scottish Government if they can. However, they make it very clear that their ongoing concerns are still on the record, and that's where that rests. And I think that addresses all the points that he raised. Well, but if any are not addressed, I'm sure others in the chamber will ask those questions.
Douglas Ross.
Just outlined in his statement how the UK Government has sought to constructively engage with the Scottish Government during the passage of this bill prior to it being voted on in the Scottish Parliament. Yet Nicola Sturgeon has now tried to turn this into a political battle between the Scottish and UK Government, when all, as I understand it, the Scottish Secretary and the Government are trying to do is protect women's rights. So despite the howls that we are getting from the SNP, can the Scottish Secretary confirm that all the SNP have to do is bring forward a bill in the Scottish Parliament that protects the rights of women and girls across the United Kingdom?
Yes, and actually I think that, Mr Speaker, fortunately that addresses one of the points that the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland raised, and I can address that here. I mean, I have written to the First Minister. I've suggested that we meet to resolve these issues, and it is the case that the Scottish Government's bill has adverse effects on those 2 pieces of Scottish legislation. You will see it in the Statement of Reasons, which has been produced by our legal advisers. And what is missing is sufficient protections and safeguards for women and children that are reflected in existing Westminster legislation, and that is why I have had to lay this order.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Dr Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Vetoing this legislation is an unprecedented attack on the Scottish Parliament, which passed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill 86 to 39, including MSPs from every single party. Gender recognition is a devolved policy area, and this does not change the 2010 Equality Act or give any additional rights to those with a certificate. It shortens and simplifies the process, and particularly ends the requirement for a psychological diagnosis of gender dysphoria. This is in keeping with the guidance from the World Health Organization and UN, which recommends change to a legal statutory process based on self-identification. This change has already been made by many countries over the last decade, including neighbours Ireland, Belgium, Denmark. But this government is threatening to end UK acceptance of international certificates. I find it bizarre, considering the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, suggested a similar proposal in 2017. So can the Secretary of State explain exactly which parts of the Equality Act are changed by this bill? Why did he not raise specific concerns during the 2 consultations carried out by the Scottish Parliament, or in response to the Cabinet Secretary's letter in October, rather than a response that came 3 days before the final debate on the bill? What modifications is he suggesting to the bill that wouldn't include a return to the outmoded medicalised process? Why is he using one of the most marginalised groups in society to pick a fight with the Scottish Parliament? Is he seriously, after 300 years of different marriage ages and voting ages, suggesting there can no longer be legal or age differences north and south of the border? And does he recognise that vetoing this bill simply highlights the hollow reality of devolution?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady won't be surprised to hear that I don't recognise very much of what she said as being correct, and I would point her to the statement of reasons which will be laid alongside this order today, and our legal advice is very clear. The Equality Act 2010 is reserved, and there are adverse effects. And they will be there in the statement of reasons. And I listed some of those in my statement I made only moments ago. I listed them areas around associations, women's safe spaces, single-sex clubs, single-sex schools, etc., etc. It was very clear. It was very clear what I said, and you will see what legal counsel have determined when you see the statement of reasons.
Laura Ferris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A Conservative government standing up for women's sex-based rights in Scotland. I congratulate the government on this decision, which we know will protect women's sex-based specialist services in areas like rape crisis. But does he... But does he agree with me? Given the verdict of the UN Special Rapporteur, given the verdict of Dr. Hilary Cass, which is not yet complete, it is essential that every corner of the United Kingdom reaches an agreed position on the age limit for a gender recognition certificate.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker.
Chair of the Select Committee, Pete Wishart.
This is the single biggest attack on Scottish devolution and Scottish democracy since the establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. A move to strike down a piece of legislation which is supported by every single party in the Parliament is as provocative as it is anti-democratic. When the Scotland Act went through Parliament back in 1997-98, the Conservatives then called Section 35 the colonial general rule. Is he now the real-life colonial general imposing his view on a reluctant Scottish Parliament in the name of his and his party's culture wars?
Mr. Speaker, I come back to my original point. This is a decision I didn't take it lightly. It was after much consideration of the legal advice that we received, and it is based on a Section 35 order which is in the 1998 Scotland Act, an act that was brought forward by the Labour Party, led through Parliament by Donald Dewar, and voted for by the Scottish National Party.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the central point here that devolution is not the same as independence? And in every devolution, to the disappointment of some, I accept, but in every devolution settlement, including ours, every devolved legislature has to legislate with consideration for the other parts of the United Kingdom. If that does not happen, Section 35 is the appropriate instrument for the UK government to consider the use of. And isn't the visceral reaction to the government's temerity in even considering the use of Section 35, where there are clear conflicts between the devolved approach and the UK approach, a demonstration that there is no acceptance on the part of the SNP of the devolution settlement at all.
Well, my learned right honourable friend is absolutely right. I mean, devolution is about granting powers, not giving powers away, and not ceding powers. And that is what the Devolution Act does. That Westminster, through the Devolution Act, gave powers to the Scottish Parliament, but the Act was very clear. It kept Section 33 and Section 35 for when there were conflicts, and a conflict has arisen here in the case of adverse effects towards UK-wide legislation in the terms of the two acts that will be referred to in the Statement of Reasons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State claims that there is a version of this bill that the UK Government will accept, and indeed it has been noted by the Chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee in this place that the bill is broadly in line with the recommendations made by their committee following their inquiry into the Gender Recognition Act. Can the Minister explain why he did not work together with counterparts in Holyrood to avoid this unnecessary and unprecedented constitutional collision? And will the Minister now make a statement here in this House as to what reform to the GRA the Government will make across the UK if they're seeking to block progressive reform in Scotland?
Well, I would say to the Honourable Lady that I am doing the constitutional part here in my role as Secretary of State for Scotland, and the Section 35 order is where the legal advice has taken me. The Minister who's on the bench, the Minister for Gender and Equalities, will deal with the policy, and you should absolutely raise your point with her.
Liam Fox, Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many in the House who will agree with the content of the Scottish Government's bill. And there are many in the House, I have to say, including myself, who will object to the contents of it. But that is not the point at issue here today. We live in a unitary state. To have different gender recognition certification processes in different parts of the United Kingdom are likely to produce conflict and confusion. Does my right honourable friend agree that it was never part of the devolution settlement that any one part of devolved government across the United Kingdom could effectively change or require a change for citizens across the whole of our unitary nation?
I absolutely agree, Mr. Speaker.
Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Government's invoking of Section 35 in this case, as the bill clearly conflicts with the Equality Act and would have repercussions for women across the UK. Does the Secretary of State recognise the strength of feeling amongst women, women's rights groups and activists in Scotland that this bill seeks to allow anyone at all to legally self-identify as either sex and therefore enter all spaces, including those necessarily segregated by sex, such as domestic violence settings, changing rooms and prisons? And given the previous UQ, does he not understand how vitally important this is at the moment?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady deserves a lot of respect for her courage in standing up on this issue. And I think when the Statement of Reasons is read later today, she will be proved to be absolutely right in the things she's saying.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Having served as Minister in the Scotland Office alongside my right honourable friend for a couple of years, I know how compassionately and diligently he has looked into these matters. It is a complex issue. There are lots of consequences. But do we not owe it to everyone to look at these matters dispassionately, to work through the points of conflict and turn the dial down on some of the heat that's been generated?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The tone is very important in these matters, and it is not a decision that I've taken lightly. It is after due consideration of the legal advice received. And yes, let's take the heat out of these matters. Let's deal with the legal issues and then see if there's a resolution we can find.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. So we've had 6 years of wide consultation, two-thirds of MSPs supporting the legislation, in support from MSPs from every single political party in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP, the Conservatives, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. Yet these actions from the Tory government are shameful and actually quite scary. So does the Secretary of State for Scotland share my concerns that this decision sets a dangerous precedent where Westminster dictates and Holyrood must simply shut up and do as they are told?
No, Mr Deputy Speaker, obviously I don't. In 24 years, the Scottish Parliament has passed 347 acts. The Scottish Government has, the United Kingdom Government has never used the Section 35 Act in that time. It has been deemed, the legal advice has been deemed that we should use it this time, and that is what we've done because there are adverse effects on UK-wide legislation.
Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I point out to my right honourable friend that as opposition spokesman on the devolution bills when they were passing through Parliament in 1988, I took part in the debate where the question of the devolution of equality rights was explicitly debated. I pointed out that anti-discrimination laws have to be handled with great care because it is all too easy to substitute one type of intolerance of minorities for another, and that is exactly what the SNP Act does by denying the rights of women and girls. But the important point is that the Labour spokesman, one of the architects of devolution, Henry McLeish, responded that the human rights might be devolved, but equal opportunities should not be devolved, that they should not be able to, that the Scottish Parliament should not be able to, and quote, that they should not be able to impose new duties or additional regulation in equal opportunities matters. It was expressly debated in the House of Commons, it was voted on in the House of Commons, and the SNP lost their amendment on that topic. Isn't it time now for the SNP to respect the devolution settlement? And can he write to the official opposition and ask them exactly what their response to his statement means? Why have the architects of devolution been replaced by weasels?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are fortunate to have a colleague of such great political sagacity amongst us who was there when the legislation was brought forward. And he is right. It was voted for as a democratic bill that went through this Parliament, supported by all parties, and that is the instrument Section 35 that we're using today is part of that bill that was brought forward by the Labour Party and supported by the Scottish National Party back in 1998.
Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, whatever your views about the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, Nicola Sturgeon's obsession with independence has clouded her judgment, and she is showing disregard for the rest of the United Kingdom and its laws. It is her own party that voted in favour of Section 35 being included in the Scotland Act. The rights of women and other vulnerable groups should not be pawns in her constitutional game playing. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that invoking Section 35 of the Scotland Act is deeply unfortunate, but however necessary, because the GRR bill has not taken due consideration in UK-wide laws, and that is, in fact, it is Nicola Sturgeon that is failing to respect devolution and the UK-wide Equality Act with her dangerous actions?
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker, I absolutely agree with the Honourable Lady. I thank her for her comments. We do not believe, and it will be in the Statement of Reasons, that there is sufficient protections and safeguards in the GRR bill for women and children.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As a committed unionist, like every member on this side of the House, but also one that respects the devolution settlement, the principle of one legislature intervening on another legislature could set a significant and serious precedent. So can my right honourable friend reassure me that the reason he is using the Section 35 order is because of specific legal concerns, because of the impact of that legislation on all parts of the United Kingdom, including Scotland, rather than for any other political means seeking to undermine devolution?
Yes.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. When we hear talk of agreed positions across the UK, what the Tory right-wingers mean Scotland does your tell. And the Labour MPs are getting cheers from these guys over there wanting to have a look at themselves. But after 6 years of consultation and discussions about the GRR bill, when did the Secretary of State, when did this government suddenly discover that equal pay is somehow threatened by it? And what is the problem with equal pay that he says is under threat?
Well, the Minister for Women and Equality has raised that subject with the Bill Minister, and it will be explained in our statement of reasons. The adverse effects are numerous. And if you read the statement, you will see those points.
Mr. Lawton.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I believe that the liberties and responsibilities of all citizens across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom are equal, which is why, amongst other things, I keenly supported the extension of same-sex marriage to Northern Ireland. Now, I share the concerns about the rights of biological women to single-sex spaces, but I'm most concerned about the capacity of children, minors, to determine their own gender and embark on potentially life-changing physical transformations. This dispute has been confected by the SNP in pursuit of their separatist agenda. So does my right honourable friend agree that it really is shameful that they have weaponised vulnerable children in pursuit of that agenda, and would impose that agenda on the majority of children across the whole of the United Kingdom?
Yes.
Colonel Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. When they finished. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In my role on the Public Affairs Constitutional Affairs Committee, I have with others been around the United Kingdom on scrutiny and the operation of devolution, of which I'm a strong supporter. The state of relationships between the Tories and the SNP is deleterious, and it's damaging all our rights. The SNP went to court to argue that sex was a legal construct, not a biological construct, and therefore has landed us in this position, and they are trading on people's rights. It's outrageous. They are disregarding sex-based rights, which is exactly... It's not acceptable for people to stand up to talk about women's sex-based rights and to be constantly badgered by men like that. Let us speak. I equally don't accept barracking from the men in the corner over there. What we need to know now, and it'd be helpful to have the reasons before going forward, is what exactly the UK government, who has not discussed this in advance of this coming here before and behaved outrageously, what exactly are they expecting the SNP Scottish Government to do to help the rights of transgender people and women?
Well, I won't go into the details of Lady Haldane's judgment in December, but you're absolutely right. That has created part of the conflict, and that again will be laid out in the statement of reasons. I'd say that to the Honourable Lady. What we would like the Scottish Government to do is to address the concerns we have around sufficient protections and safeguards for women and children across UK-wide legislation, and that to be reflected in the bill.
Bell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Could I welcome the order the Secretary of State made today? I'm sure the legislation passed by Holyrood was well-intentioned, but in their unwillingness, and I don't know whether it was stubbornness or naivety, to accept that there will be a tiny minority of bad actors, passing that bill without the amendments that were proposed by my right honourable friend here and his colleagues means that they're putting the sex-based rights of women and girls across the United Kingdom at risk. And is that not the point, Secretary of State, that it's not just affecting Scotland, it's affecting women and girls across the United Kingdom?
Yes, indeed.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The real truth of the GRA discussion is that almost 5 years ago, this government opened up a consultation for GRA reform and did sweet nothing on it. Opened up that Pandora's box of fear and of hate and of misinformation, and then when one part of our country takes action, which we all should have taken action, they want to use it for a constructed constitutional crisis. Is it not time that this government bring forward proper GRA reform that includes the bases that are laid out in the Scotland Act and put to bed once and for all the lie that this is about equalities?
Well, I'm here to answer to the constitutional decision I've taken, but I suggest you go to orals and ask those questions of the Minister for Women and Equalities.
Rachel McLean.
Mr Deputy Speaker, in response to some of the comments from the SNP benches, I'm happy to look at myself and stand up here and speak about protections for 16 and 17-year-olds who are able to self-ID as a legal opposite sex, travel to this country and then become part of our society. There is a clear read across to the Equalities Act in our country. Having served in the Home Office and seen the desperate need for women and girls to be protected from grooming gangs, from predators, from sex offenders, to access those single-sex based services, which we thankfully have protections for them to do here.
Order. Let's not have that. You may not agree with what people are saying, but please have the respect that they have the ability to say what they want to say. This is what we should be doing in this House. Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Does the Secretary of State therefore agree with me? This is absolutely the right thing to do. I support his action, and women and girls across the country in the other 3 nations are also going to thank him for it.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and it is absolutely about safeguards and protecting safe spaces for women and children. She's absolutely right on that. And the risk of lowering the bar for bad faith actors, she makes that point as well.
Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Enacting Section 35 is disgraceful and unprecedented, and doing so brings the risk of this political tactic being used again. Does he envision Section 35 being used against any other bills progressing through Holyrood, and if not, why only this bill?
Well, I would say to the honourable lady that she's absolutely right. This is unprecedented. It is a very high bar. It was not a decision I reached easily or took lightly, but the legal advice was very strong, and it was for Section 35, and I have used it. But as I said earlier, 347 acts have gone through the Scottish Parliament in the last nearly 24 years. The system works. The Scotland Act 1998 works, but in that Act, whether you like it or not, but whether the SNP like it or not, however, remember, they did vote for it in 1998. There is a Section 35 order, and it's for this type of event.
Caroline Johnson.
Mr Deputy Speaker, there will be those in this House that agree and those that disagree with the substance of Scotland's Gender Recognition Reform Bill. But the SNP surely knew, as they rushed this legislation through Holyrood, that it would bring them into direct conflict with the UK Parliament legislation and with the devolution agreement. Indeed, some may speculate that that was their intention. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the SNP should respect the devolution agreement that they voted for and not use women, girls or transgender individuals as pawns in their separatist agenda?
Yes, and this, I'd say to my honourable friend, this is entirely a legal debate we're having. It's about the Scotland Act 1998, and we shouldn't be bringing in or politicising the transgender community. I was disappointed by the First Minister's remarks yesterday. We respect them, we value them. This decision is entirely about the legal advice I've received.
In Blackford.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we often hear about respecting the Scottish Parliament, but isn't it the case that this absolutely demonstrates that power devolved is power retained? We accept that the Secretary of State has the powers enshrined in the Scotland Act under Section 35, but what the Secretary of State has just done is ignored the fact that parties that voted for this in the Scottish Parliament had a manifesto commitment. It has the majority support of the Scottish Parliament, and it absolutely demonstrates to everybody in Scotland that if you want to protect your Parliament, if you want to protect the rights of the Scottish Parliament to legislate and devolve matters, then we have to take away the threat of action from the Secretary of State. And the only way, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we protect our Parliament is by Scotland becoming independent.
Mr Speaker, I've just won a £10 note.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, this just proves to me, this latest debacle from the SNP proves that they are not fit to govern in Scotland. It's absolutely pathetic. But does the Secretary of State agree with me that this gender reform bill, so-called gender reform bill from the SNP, is just a pathetic, snidey attempt to use young people, a cynical attempt on their pathetic pathway to independence?
Mr Speaker, the position I accept is that what I'm doing here is addressing the legal issues as advised to by legal counsel. The issue here is adverse effects on UK-wide legislation, the Equalities Act, the Gender Recognition Act 2004, and that is what I'm entirely focused on.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I listened very carefully to what the Secretary of State said, but I didn't hear a clear explanation as to why the government believes the Scottish Gender Recognition Act conflicts with the UK Equality Act, as in all it does is it simplifies and demedicalises the process of transition. It doesn't change the status of somebody who has transitioned. That used to be Conservative Party policy. It's the policy of many other civilised countries, a growing number of countries. It's not good enough for him to say he's going to publish something later today. He speaks for the government. He needs to be able to explain the rationale for this drastic move here to the House now. The government also needs to explain what's it going to do with all those foreign nationals who come from countries that already have some form of self-identification. Is the government, the UK government, seriously going to take away their rights retrospectively?
Well, no, we're not, and the Minister for Women and Equalities has done a WMS on that. And regarding the changes, there are changes which are 16 to 18-year-olds, self-ID without any medical diagnosis. These are changes, but most importantly, from the legal advice I have, and it will be in the Statement of Reasons, it's very detailed, which is why I don't want to bore everyone to death with it now. The Statement of Reasons shows the adverse effects on two pieces of UK-wide legislation, and that is the reason the Section 35 is deemed appropriate.
Mark Jenkinson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for standing firm on the facts against the noise? Does he agree with me that rather than manufacturing constitutional battles, the SNP would be better focusing their energies on fixing the failures across Scotland, not least in health and education?
Well, again, I don't want to bore everyone with a long list, but we could add ferries and many other things to that list.
Mary Black.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I notice that the Secretary of State fails to mention that this is the most consulted piece of legislation that has ever gone through the Scottish Parliament. So this idea that it is being rushed is nothing more than a lie. Now, as I've said, this is already an attack on devolution. It is an attack using and weaponising the most vulnerable group in our society. And on that note, I want to ask the Secretary of State then, just in his own words, what does he think the point of the Scottish Parliament is?
Hear, hear.
Well, the point of the Scottish Parliament is to serve the people of Scotland on the areas that are devolved to them, but to be clear, within the Scotland Act and the terms of the Scotland Act. And it's not an attack on devolution to use a Section 35 order where it's deemed appropriate by legal counsel. When the Scottish National Party voted for that very act themselves with that order in it.
Jonathan Gallus.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome the statement made by the Secretary of State, and I want to also place on record my support for the heroines such as J.K. Rowling and others who stand up despite the continued aggression and violent abuse they receive from certain people in this place and across the Scottish Parliament. Does the Secretary of State agree with me? This is simply about protecting young girls and women to their right to having safety in single-sex spaces, and this politicisation of that is an absolute abomination.
Well, it is, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's also about protecting the devolution settlement and 2 UK-wide acts.
Alison Thewlis.
Deputy Speaker, I've been contacted by Mackenzie, an inspirational woman I met recently in my constituency, and she says, I did not choose to be trans. I did not choose to have my rights taken away, and I certainly did not choose to have my life up for debate from people who don't even know or empathise with my community. So can he tell me, in the absence of the UK doing anything whatsoever about improving trans rights, why he's standing in the way of the Scottish Government making progress?
Well, I would suggest to the Honourable Lady, first of all, of course, we respect and support the trans community, but if she wants to raise specific issues, the Minister for Women and Equalities is very happy to have a meeting with you.
Paul Bristow.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that if this House passed legislation that impinged on what should be a devolved competence, there would be howls of protest opposite? The fact they're shouting down women in this House over UK-based equality legislation show that this is not about equalities at all. It's all about bashing the UK, and for them, single-sex-based rights is just collateral damage.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very fair point. This is not, for me, about anything other than following the legal advice, the adverse effects of UK-wide equalities legislation, which, of course, involves safe single-sex spaces.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There clearly, as we've heard, is disagreement about the process that is contained within the legislation the Scottish Parliament has passed. But could the Secretary of State clarify something? Because whether one agrees with that or not, the net result would be someone would be issued with a gender recognition certificate. He argues, in invoking Section 35, that this would have serious adverse impacts on the operation of the Equality Act. Can he explain why the same certificate issued under the 2004 Act does not have those adverse impacts?
Exactly.
Well, what I say to the honourable gentleman, what we're trying to do here is avoid 2 different regimes which conflict either side of the border.
Nick Fletcher.
Mr. Speaker, I stand in full support of the Secretary of State's decision this morning. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the SNP are using this subject to deliberately cause division to further their single-issue campaign of creating an independent Scotland, regardless of the consequences to children and women across this nation?
You should be ashamed. You should be ashamed.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that's the conclusion some people might have reached when listening to the question from the honourable member from Ross Skye and Loch Arbor.
Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Of course, members opposite impinged on devolved competencies and legislation last night when they voted for their anti-strike legislation. But can the Secretary of State tell us, since the Scottish Parliament has passed this gender recognition reform bill and his decision today, what correspondence has he had with the Scottish Government to try and resolve the issue? Or is it him that's a bad faith actor?
Well, as I think I've said, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Minister for Women and Equalities and officials, civil service officials, had a number of engagements. My involvement comes after the event because it is a constitutional involvement, but on the policy area, it was the gender policy area is absolutely for the Minister to have that engagement, and she not only wrote, she also had a meeting.
James Daly.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I very warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement today? And does he agree with me that it does seem quite extraordinary that the criticism of his decision today seems to be that members opposite would have him not act upon legal advice which states that this legislation impinges upon the rights of women, children and some of the most vulnerable in our community. If the Scottish Secretary was not undertaking this action today, that would be a bigger outrage than what we have heard here today. This government is the defender of the rights of those who are most vulnerable and who need protecting in our society. society, and it is a disgrace that this has been painted in the constitutional light it is by the SNP for their own end, rather than the rights of women and children in our country.
Absolutely, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Ardell.
This Tory government make me sick to my stomach. And if this Secretary of State is going to come to this House and trample all over trans rights, over Scottish democracy and over equality, he should at the very least do his homework, because he clearly knows as little about this bill as he does about devolution. So can the Secretary of State tell me, are he and his government so scared of democracy and equality that he really thinks it's justifiable to use one of the most marginalised groups in our society as political fodder in their anti-trans, anti-equality and anti-democratic endeavours?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't recognise any of those remarks. This is absolutely following legal advice and not taking the decision lightly on the adverse effects that this bill has on two UK-wide, GB-wide bills. And that is the position we're in. We have written to the Scottish Government to explain our position. We will lay the statement of reasons later. This is nothing to do with trampling over transgender rights. This is entirely to do with following a legal process and taking the legal advice that we sought.
Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State for Scotland knows the value in which I hold the Union, so I'm sure he will understand how difficult this is for me. But as a Scottish woman, the mother of a Scottish daughter, someone who has campaigned and continues to campaign and work for women's safety, I have heard the concerns, and I have looked at every clause and amendment of this bill, spoken with MSP colleagues from all parties, in the search for where it undermines the Equalities Act and the protections in single-sex spaces and others that it offers me and every other woman that I know. I can't find it. Some of the UK's finest legal minds have pored over this hugely scrutinised bill in great detail and found no conflict. But I can see where it actually guarantees that it will not challenge the primacy of the Equalities Act. So can the Secretary of State point me to the exact lines of this bill which he feels undermines my and every other woman's rights, and justify why he is playing fast and loose with the Union and really doing so much to hurt the most vulnerable people in our society?
Well, that's simply not true. I'm looking to protect the vulnerable, as she will see. The legal opinion may well be divided on this, but the legal opinion we've taken is that there are adverse effects on the Equalities Act and the Gender Recognition 2004 Act. And I note the First Minister's comments earlier today that she intends to take this to judicial review. So we'll find out in the Court of Opinion, whether the Court of Opinion that I've been hearing is right or wrong when we go to the legal courts.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would love to hear from the Minister more detail on the legal advice that has been given, because I'm still unclear how this would undermine the Equality Act. And I would also like to say, isn't it true that the only reason we are here is because of government failure to listen to its own consultation with 100,000 people responding to it, and also using trans people as a political football, for example, leaving them out of the conversion therapy until conveniently this week?
Well, look, I would urge the benches opposite to reflect the tone here. This is a legal decision. We need to take the heat out of this debate. What we are dealing with is a reduction in safeguards for women and children. That is the legal advice we have, and later when you read the statement of reasons, you will be able to draw your own conclusions.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the United Kingdom's first ever female First Minister is enjoying the lecture from the Secretary of State and the various Cicero tribute acts behind him on feminism and the protection of women's rights. Isn't it the case, Mr Deputy Speaker, that what we have here is a decaying government in its last months in office, needing some red meat for its base, an utterly supine Labour Party trying to triangulate through all of this, Meanwhile, trans people are the collateral damage. Just as Section 28 haunted Thatcher's government, Section 35 will always be associated with him. So let me ask him. He must surely have the statement of reasons in that folder on his knee. Read it out from the dispatch box.
We will publish the statement of reasons, and on the other remarks the honourable gentleman made, Mr. Deputy Speaker, opinions may vary.
Ms Saville-Roberts.
This is a calculated attack on devolution, democracy and trans rights, and it's increasingly clear that this tired and bitter Tory government will weaponise any issue, no matter how sensitive, and they'll do that to subvert devolution. Now, if this is really about the Equality Act, ministers would be referring this to the courts. They wouldn't be withholding their own legal advice. They would be seen to have this tested in the courts, rather than taking, as they are, unprecedented unilateral action. So what does he have to say to the unionist Welsh Labour Minister Vaughan Gething, who today said that this UK government undermines the union?
Well, obviously, Mr. Deputy, I entirely agree. We are supporting the union. The devolution bill is what we believe in, and Section 35 order was democratically put there. And we believe that we have to take the legal advice we have. And people say read out the statement of reasons. The statement of reasons and my order will have been submitted to the parliamentary authorities, and they'll be available in the time frame when they decide to release them this afternoon. And you will be able to read everything you want to read there as to the reasons behind this, but essentially it's about protecting and safeguarding women and children where we believe there are adverse effects.
Kirsty Blackman.
Speaker, against a background of rising hate crime, my trans siblings will be horrified and terrified at the level of misinformation and lies in this chamber today. Given that the Secretary of State has had lots of legal advice on this, presumably he's also had briefings on this, could he tell us what is the effect of a gender recognition certificate? What does it entitle someone to do?
Well, we believe we believe you'll see in the legals in the statement of reasons that there is a reduction. I make this very point very clear. There is a reduction in safeguards for women and children, and you will have plenty of time to read that today.
Danny Whittam.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The reason why the government can't tell us exactly what the conflict is with the Equality Act is because there isn't one. The Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill does not affect the operation of the Equality Act, and everyone in this House knows that full well because Labour MSP Pam Duncan-Glancy put it on the face of the bill with their amendment. So will the Minister admit what this Section 35 order is really about, and that is fanning the flames of a culture war that is harming trans people across the UK?
No, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy, that's an appalling thing to say. It is entirely addressing the legal advice that I've been given, and the legal advice tells me that there is a reduction in safeguards across conflicting with two UK-wide bills, and that is the reason for the Section 35 order, and that is why the advice was to use it, and it will be available to all this afternoon.
Deirdre Brock.
Deputy Speaker, and as has been clarified by my honourable friend, the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire South, this Act has been under consideration by the Scottish Parliament for 6 years. Now, if the UK government thought there was some legal basis to challenge the bill, why didn't they do so in the Supreme Court through a Section 33 order before now, as they've done previously?
I'm afraid I don't want to be rude to the honourable lady, but I'm afraid what she just said shows that she does not understand the Scotland Act or what actions are available to the United Kingdom government. We cannot bring forward a Section 33 Act while a bill is going through. the Scottish Parliament, nor can we invoke a Section 35 Act while a bill is going through. Once the bill has finished its final stage, its third stage, there's a 28-day process, and the legal advice, which I must say, this legal advice is taken on all bills that the Scottish Parliament passes. That's part of the devolution settlement, and then we decide what course needs to be taken based on the advice we get. And on this occasion, the advice is that a Section 33 is not appropriate, but a Section 35 is.
Owen Thompson.
Speaker, I have to say I think it's exceptionally discourteous of the Secretary of State to consistently refer to this statement of reasons that nobody in here except him appears to be able to be seen. This isn't an urgent question. This wasn't something that he didn't know about. This was a statement that he brought himself. So we should have had the statement of reasons before we came to this statement. But I wanted to ask the Secretary of State, what is it about persistent electoral failure in Scotland that makes him so averse to following the principles of basic democracy?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is beyond parody. It's democracy. Democracy is what the Scotland Act is. Section 35 is in the Scotland Act. The SNP voted for the Scotland Act with Section 35 in it. It is a democratic instrument.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his statement and agree that women and girls must be protected and safeguarded. The Minister will be aware that a precedent was set for the circumnavigation of devolution when Government here brought abortion and demand legislation for Northern Ireland. With great respect to my colleagues and this friend, who, I recall the members who are my friends representing Scotland, I do not recall the members defending the cause then for Northern Ireland. So will the Minister confirm the precedent supported by many who are opposing today means that the Government retains a right to step in for issues that they deem to be equality and human rights?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Northern Ireland bills, so I won't stray into that area. But I will say that the protections and safeguards for women and children that we have been advised need to be looked at by these adverse effects. That's what we're dealing with the Section 35 Act today, which is part of the Scotland Act.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You would think that before pulling the trigger on a Section 35, you'd be absolutely across your brief. Yep. But it seems today that the Secretary of State hasn't got a clue about this at all. We've heard very little about process and even less about substance. But the Secretary of State says that this would have significant impact on, amongst other things, GB-wide equality matters in Scotland, England and Wales. What consultation, can I ask then, has he had with the Welsh Government or Senate before this drastic intervention? Or is this really an issue for the de facto English Government as a priority? And isn't it the case that with independence looming larger than ever before this crumbling union, this is an act of desperate democratic vandalism?
No, I believe the UK Government did consult a number of years ago. The Minister for Women Equalities tells me did consult a number of years ago, and Wales would have been included in that consultation. But the point is that there is no democratic whatever that you're saying. It's entirely a democratic bill that has Section 35 in it, that we are now using that order to protect what we believe is women and children's safeguards, because we believe they are undermined by the cut across into 2 GB-wide bills.
Wayne David.
Speaker, in his response to the Shadow Secretary of State, the Secretary of State for Scotland said that Article 35 in the 1998 Act was not an instrument of last resort. But then, after that, there was the Memorandum of Understanding signed in 2012, which made it an instrument of last resort by common agreement. So I want to ask the Secretary of State, what discussions on a constitutional basis has he had with the First Minister of Scotland to avoid this impasse?
Yeah, well, I'm glad. I thank the honourable gentleman for that point, because it's not the last resort. What I said to his honourable friend, is that we have 28 days. We take the legal advice. We have to act within that 28 days, because then, failing that, the bill goes for royal assent, and that's the time frame we operate in. There's then the opportunity for further discussions with the Scottish Government to see if we can get the legislation in scope. We made the same offer with the UNCRC bill, which we took to a Section 33, and that offer still stands. We're happy to discuss with the Scottish Government what amendments can be made to the bill to get it in scope and not cut across have adverse effects in UK-wide legislation. So, last resort isn't last. There's never quite a last resort when you can go on talking and discussing and trying to resolve your differences.
Stuart Housie.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's true that UK ministers do have the right to interfere under Section 35 in Scottish legislation on the grounds of defence, national security, international obligations, or if the Scottish legislation modifies or has an adverse effect on UK reserved law. That much is clear. But given the Tory chair of the Women and Equalities Committee has said that the GRR legislation, quotes, does not change the Equalities Act, and that the Scottish Secretary has been singularly incapable of giving a single example of where it might. This is not about process. This is a debate on principle. And would it not be better, instead of interfering, instead of engaging in a rather crass culture war, if the Scottish Secretary apologised to trans people, apologised for trampling over Scottish democracy, folded up his little red folder and removed the threat to interfere?
Well, I ask again, let's just take the heat out of this debate. This is about the 2010 Equalities Act, which is a GB-wide piece of legislation, and the legal advice we have that there are adverse effects to that bill. That's entirely what it is, and that will be published this afternoon in the Statement of Reasons.
Stephen Furry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I stand in solidarity with Scottish colleagues across the political spectrum. It is worth pointing out that it's important that we do harmonise equality and rights issues upwards, but the UK is not a unitary state in these matters. The Secretary of State has jumped backwards and forwards in terms of describing the Equality Act as either UK-wide or Great Britain. It does not apply in Northern Ireland, just to make that very clear in terms of the record. But in particular, does the Secretary of State recognise that similar legislation has been in place in the Republic of Ireland for over 7 years now? And we in the UK have the common travelling area with Ireland, which has reciprocal rights of freedom of movement and also in terms of social security and other areas. So if the government can manage to live with a different system of GRA in Ireland, why not Scotland?
Well, last time I looked, the Republic of Ireland wasn't part of Great Britain or the United Kingdom. It is absolutely the case that we're talking about British citizens here being affected. I'm told there is no devolved administration anywhere in Europe that has different gender rules to the state.
Mr. Oswald.
Oh, sorry, Mr Speaker, thank you. It's really very regrettable that the Secretary of State has come here today on this issue and with so little information. I think that all of those, this very vulnerable group who are impacted by what he is wanting to do, really deserve significantly better than the Secretary of State standing up repeatedly with absolutely no information, telling us that a statement of reasons will be published later, and yet he is unable to tell us what these reasons are. It is his job to tell us what these reasons are, and he has singularly failed to do that today. It is no wonder that his former colleague, the former Scottish Conservative Head of Communications, Andy McKeever, when looking at how the UK Government is dealing with this issue, has described the UK Government intervening here as an act of constitutional vandalism. And he said it demonstrates Westminster's superiority complex in overdrive. Does the Secretary of State recognise that people will reasonably and rightly feel that way, and that as well as their concerns about this marginalised group, they will feel extremely unhappy about this overriding of our democracy?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, no. I hope people will realise that the United Kingdom Government has been given legal advice that raises concerns for women and children and their safeguards and protections and adverse effects to UK-wide legislation, and that we are acting on that, and we have the backs of women and children across the United Kingdom and in Scotland if their safeguards and their single-sex spaces only, and etc., are impinged upon. If that's the issue, if that is the issue that you will see in the Statement of Reasons, if that's the concern, we believe it is right to act on that for all citizens of Great Britain.
Mr. Speaker, the Women and Equalities Committee in 2021 published a report which clearly stated then, and is still the case now, that the Gender Recognition Certificate did not impinge on women or girls' rights. It was very clear and very unequivocal. It stated very clearly that the exclusions applied in all instances and that women and girls would continue to be protected regardless of the Gender Recognition Certificate. The same applies in this case to the Gender Recognition Reform Act, and there is nothing within the proposals that contradicts that. So will the Minister stand here today, now, clearly, and issue very outline of what legal advice he has been given, and state here in this chamber right now what the legal advice is, because we're still waiting.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in short, two different regimes create adverse effects.
See MacDonald.
Hey, Mr. Speaker, these answers are absolutely pathetic. Can I ask, why is it that states and territories in the US and Canada and Australia can successfully operate self-ID without interference or complaint from either neighbouring territories or from central government, but that can't happen here, where we're supposed to have the most powerful devolved parliament in the world? And secondly, can I ask him, why does the Equalities Unit fact sheet produced by his government for its own consultation on self-ID state clearly there will be no change to the provision of women-only spaces and services? This has been the law since 2010 and will not change. He's grubbing around for legal advice in order to peddle myths in this chamber, is he not?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I did say that there was no devolved administration in Europe that had different gender rules to the state. But the honourable gentleman raises the USA, Canada and Australia, where there's no central ID law because they're very differently. They are federal structures.
Peter Grant.
Mr. Speaker, could the Secretary of State maybe take some heat out of this argument by confirming a few matters of fact that a lot of his colleagues seem to be unaware of? Could he confirm that this rush piece of legislation has been under 6 years of scrutiny by the Scottish Parliament? Could he confirm that during that period, in the last Scottish Parliament elections, an overwhelming majority of MSPs were elected on explicit manifesto commitments in favour of this legislation? Could he confirm that there is absolutely nothing in this legislation that makes any difference to the rights or ability of anybody to go into any protected single-sex space in Scotland or anywhere else in the world? And finally, will he confirm that when he eventually has a courtesy to let us see what he intends to put forward and the advice on which it is based, will he guarantee that this House will have a further chance to consider and vote on what he's proposing?
Well, I didn't catch all of everything. My tinnitus gets the better of me sometimes, and I didn't catch everything the honourable gentleman said. But I think he asked if. I mean, as to all the legal reasons, we've covered that 100 times today. But as to whether or not there'll be a chance for another debate and another vote, my understanding with Section 35 is that the opposition have 40 days to pray upon it, and that would then lead to a debate in this Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Secretary of State for vetoing Scotland is going to be quite disappointed when he eventually gets to the House of Lords, because not even for all its faults does the House of Lords have the kind of veto power that he's exercising today. Indeed, even the United States President, if he vetoes a bill, it is subject to checks and balances by the Congress. So just further to my friend and further to what he just said, if a motion is tabled praying against the Section 35 order, will the government guarantee that time will be made available for a debate and a vote on the floor of this House?
Well, that, Mr. Speaker, is a question for the Leader of the House.
Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon. Mr. Speaker, in the earlier oral statement by the Secretary of State for Scotland, he said it is open to the Scottish Government to bring back an amended bill for reconsideration in the Scottish Parliament. Can I ask what provisions would need to be added or taken away from the original bill to make it acceptable to this Government?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I think I said earlier that basically, regarding the amendment, any amendment to the bill, if the Scottish Government wanted to bring it back, they have to address. I know there are difficulties for them in this, but they would have to address the central issue, which is that the So we don't believe, in the cross-cut against GB legislation, that there are sufficient protections and safeguards for women and children. And there is, as I say, it is as reflected in existing Westminster legislation.
Right.
No, taking them after.
No, I'm going to take point of orders. I want to get through to this. After the 10-minute rule bill, I will take point of order before, depending on what the House decides. I call Stephen Flynn to make an application for leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration. Under the terms of Standing Order number 24, the honourable member has 3 minutes in which to make such an application. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to seek your permission to have a debate this afternoon under Section 24 of Standing Orders in respect of the unprecedented and unjustifiable decision of this United Kingdom government to overturn the views and the legislative programme of the democratically elected members of Scotland's National Parliament in Holyrood. Mr. Speaker, the arguments on this matter are lengthy. Some of them have just been covered. Many more will hopefully be covered in a debate to come, should you so seek to grant it. And I am not seeking to be presumptuous in that regard. But should you seek to grant it, I will endeavour to cover those many points and to highlight to this chamber and to the public the democratic shortfall that exists at the heart of this supposed union of equals. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member asks leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration, namely that this House has considered the Government's decision to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act with regard to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. I have listened carefully to the application of the honourable member. I am satisfied that the matter raised by the honourable member is proposed to be discussed under Standing Order number 24, and that the honourable member has leave of the House. If no objection, we then come to the motion that the member has obtained the leave of the House. The debate will be held today immediately after the 10-minute rule motion. The debate will last 2 hours and will arise on the motion that the House has considered that the specific matter set out in the honourable member's application. I shall remind the House that the Standing Order number 24 provides for additional time taken by this debate to be added on the end of the proceedings of the Safety Bill. Right, let us now go to the 10-minute rule bill. I said I was going to deal with them after the 10-minute rule bill. I'm going to put them all together. Okay. We now come to the 10-minute rule bill. Simon Baines.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Secretary of State to undertake a review of the support available to markets and market traders and of the options for improving that support and for connected purposes. Markets, Mr. Speaker, are close to my heart, as my grandfather's butcher's business, R.A. Dodds, was based in the Granger Market in Newcastle, where they had 5 stalls, and from where they expanded between the wars to establish shops across Northumberland. I grew up hearing stories of the family business, which sadly no longer exists, but the memories are still strong, as I found a few years ago when visiting the Granger Market. Also, when I was Mayor of Llanfachlin 5 years ago, I played a key part in establishing a farmers' market in the town each summer. I am delighted to have 11 colleagues from across the House as co-sponsors of this bill, and I know they, like me, strongly support their local markets, particularly my constituency neighbour, the Honourable Member for Wrexham, with whom I, as the MP for Clwyd South, share the parliamentary representation of Wrexham County Borough Council. The city of Wrexham has its origins as a market town, and the livestock market was at one time the largest in Wales. The People's Market is now T-Pawb, the Central Market continues in its traditional way, and the Butcher's Market is due for redevelopment next year to offer a wide range of high-quality Welsh food and drink. Markets also play an important role in Clwyd South, where street and specialist markets held in Llangollen, on the Rheg estate and elsewhere in the constituency make a marked contribution to our society. I was also, until August last year, the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Markets Group, which gave me further valuable insight into the successes and needs of the markets industry. Markets are part of the history and tradition of many towns and cities in the UK. The most recent survey of the markets industry indicates some 1,150 traditional markets are now trading at an outlet for an amazing figure of over 32,000 small and medium-sized enterprises. They exist through charters from the Crown, custom and practice, and statutory legislation. In addition, there are numerous specialist markets, continental and Christmas markets, that generate essential footfall for town and city centres and support local economies, tourism, hospitality and employment. Two national organisations represent the markets industry: the Association of British Market Authorities, NABMA, that focuses on market operators, local authorities, private operators, CICs and charities, and the National Market Traders Federation, NMTF, that supports market traders across the UK. Both organisations currently meet with the government through the Retail Forum and the All-Party Parliamentary Markets Group. Slowly, the market industry is returning from the financial, community and personal damages of COVID. The recovery has seen some markets enjoying success in attracting investment as part of exciting regeneration schemes, but for others the picture is still not encouraging. The NABMA 2022 survey was the first meaningful assessment of the state of the markets industry since the pandemic. The main headlines and questions arising from the survey of 241 markets are as follows. Stall occupancy has fallen from a national average of 77% 4 years ago to 72%. Street markets and outdoor covered markets have seen the greatest decline. How can we reverse the decline? More markets are operating, that they are operating at a loss, a 6% increase from 4 years ago. Only 40% of markets are trading with a surplus. Is this sustainable going forward, and how can this be reversed? Markets feature heavily as part of town and city regeneration for a number of local authorities. How can government funding be attracted to deliver successful and modern markets? Traditional family businesses are declining, especially those specialist businesses such as butchers and fishmongers. How does the market industry attract new and younger traders? Markets are at the heart of local communities. They are part of local history, but also have a key role to play in the future of communities and government initiatives, particularly levelling up. A key area for the government to address is on business rates. In 2022, business rates assessed on markets totalled over £20 million. The Chancellor announced the relief of business rates for many businesses, but due to an anomaly, local authority markets do not enjoy the benefits of this measure. Now, because of restrictions in the local authority finance legislation, a local authority cannot grant a concession to itself on business rates, whereas private markets can take advantage of the benefit. Therefore, a key part of the review called for in this bill would be for the government to look at extending business rate relief to local authority markets, including parish, town and community councils. Markets operated under charitable trusts should also be beneficiaries. The markets industry has taken several important initiatives via NABMA and NMTF to address areas which need more support. I believe that these initiatives provide pointers to the areas in which the government could focus its support for the industry. Firstly, recognising the fall in market occupancy in local businesses, the industry is delivering a campaign entitled Grow a Business in 2023 to attract more individuals to try out market trading. This is especially for young traders, but also individuals that are looking at a second or new career. Part of the historic success of market trading is to see small businesses prosper and grow and then move into the local high street. Never has this been more important. Secondly, the industry's Young Traders Market campaign celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2022. From relatively small beginnings, it has grown into an incredibly successful campaign. The winners go on to 10 regional finals involving 250 young people, and then 90 of them go to the national final held in Stratford-upon-Avon. During the campaign, many sustainable businesses have been created, and it is a flagship for the industry. Thirdly, the Love Your Local Market campaign has gone from strength to strength over the last 12 years. Its origin lay in the Mary Portas Review into the Future of the High Streets, which was commissioned by former Prime Minister David Cameron in 2011. The government at the time was concerned with the same issues as concern the government today, the contraction of retail, and it was seeking to deliver real change in communities and make towns multifunctional places to live, work and visit. Markets featured prominently in the Porter's report, which said markets can serve as fundamental traffic drivers back to our high streets. The Love Your Local Market campaign, which is now in its 12th year, attracts more and more support and is now celebrated around the world in over 25 countries. Government provided funding support to launch the campaign, which serves as an important catalyst to change. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, the value of markets to our local communities is widely recognised, and I know that the Government is keen to be as supportive as possible. As is called for in this bill, a review by the Government of the support available for markets and of the options for improving that support would be welcomed with open arms by market operators and traders alike, and bring lasting benefits to our communities across the length and breadth of the UK.
This would normally be the opportunity for one MP who wishes to oppose this 10-minute rule motion to do so. I see nobody wishes to do so, and I have had no indication either. So I will just pose the question. And the question is that honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Sarah Atherton, Paul Bristow, James Daly, Sally Ann Hart, Mr David Jones, Ben Lake, Robin Miller, Robbie Moore, Helen Morgan, Jim Shannon, Matt Vickers and myself, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Baines.
Markets and Market Traders Review of Support Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 24th of February, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Friday the 24th of February. Thank you very much. Right. Order, please. Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very grateful for you taking a point of order. In the earlier programme in the House, you rightly agreed for a Section 24 emergency application, which the House has agreed to hold today. But I fear we may have a bit of an empty debate because the statement of reasons for why the Government have called the Section 35 order, which is unprecedented, it's never happened in the history of this House before, have not been given to members and will not be laid until later this afternoon in the library. And I wonder if it could seek your guidance on whether or not the Section 24 debate should be postponed until such times as not only have they been published, but we've had time to digest them.
Can I just say, we have got the Secretary of State with us. I don't know we'd like to inform the House where we're up to.
Secretary of State. Thank you, Mr Speaker. We laid the order at 12:34 with the statement of reasons. The House authorities have to clear it before they publish it. They won't do that till 5 p.m. However, what I have got dispensation to do from Mr Speaker, I have got dispensation to publish it on the UK Gov website, the statement of reasons. We're doing that now. They're being emailed to you, to the Honourable Member for Edinburgh West, and to the Honourable Member for Aberdeen South. You are having them emailed, the statement of reasons emailed to you now.
A point for us, Mr Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In relation to what the Secretary of State for Scotland has just said, we've had in excess of an hour's worth of questioning to him, where he's repeatedly mentioned the statement of reasons, which we have until this point not seen. I'm now being told that I'm going to receive the statement of reasons. I think it would be wise, Mr Speaker, with your guidance for the House to be suspended so that all of us can consider those reasons in full prior to the debate, because they will have obviously an intrinsic value to all of us in that regard.
Further to that point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Further to that point of order.
Sorry, further to that point of order, and then I will come. Yes. Go on now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It remains, or I remain, to be convinced whether or not the Secretary of State understands the effect of a gender recognition certificate, but it is surely now apparent that he does not understand the concept of parliamentary accountability. Since, as long as I have been in this House, if the House were to be made aware of a government document or a publication of any sort, it was placed in the House of Commons library. It was not sent by email to individual named members. Surely all members of this United Kingdom Parliament have an interest in knowing what the government position is, and there is no good reason for this unprecedented departure from previous process.
For the point of
Mr. Speaker. And this has been an absolute utter mess today. The Secretary of State made a voluntary statement. He wasn't forced to the House through an urgent question. He came voluntarily. And central to the government's case has been that the GRR bill, as passed by the Scottish Parliament, conflicts with the Equality Act. And he has a statement of reasons as to why that is the case. He never provided that statement of reasons for members to question him on. Now he's going to be supplying it through email. Could I insist that you follow the leader of the Scottish National Party so that we have an opportunity to adjourn to consider this properly, that we could come back and question the Secretary of State, who has to be at the dispatch box in the next debate on these statements of reasons, so we get to question them on the reasons why this UK government is invoking a Section 35 order against this legislation.
Point of order, Costello.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I noticed that the Secretary of State in the previous session said that he had not brought the statement of reasons and that he did not want to bore us with it. And I found that quite an extraordinary statement to make, given the gravity of the situation and the gravity of the subject matter that we are dealing with. I wonder if he has now changed his mind and doesn't think that it is something that is tedious and boring for us to deal with, but actually realises that this is a serious, important piece of dialogue that we should have had from him in advance of this session. And I wonder if you're able to give us any guidance, Mr. Speaker, on how everyone who wanted to contribute to the previous session and didn't have the information might be able to contribute to this session in full possession of the information.
Further to that point of order, Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if you can advise the House if this situation has any precedent where a Government Minister or Secretary of State can turn up at the dispatch box without the necessary accompanying information to advise and guide the discussion and debate in a question session, which it seems to, in my experience here since I was elected, Mr. Speaker, seems to be the way that things are supposed to have been done. Is this precedented, or is this unprecedented, this shambolic behaviour from the Secretary of State for Scotland?
Right, well, I think we've got to try and make some progress. Sorry, Owen Thompson, I know. Go on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that. I seek your advice, and I apologise to Mr. Deputy Speaker for trying to intervene during the question session. However, I think it's important because the statement of reasons is clearly a critical factor in the discussion we're having. We've not been able to question the Secretary of State on it through the statement he made at a time when he brought the statement. We're going to have a debate which is encouraging and welcome, but most of us want to have the chance to have seen the statement of reasons before that starts. So can I ask for your advice, Mr. Speaker, as to what further opportunities, even beyond this Section 24 debate, members of this chamber will have to question the Secretary of State in detail on the statement of reasons when they eventually get around to publishing it?
Brown, I think that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So further to that point of order, as has been said, with over an hour of questions there, a voluntary statement from the Secretary of State, they kept referring to the statement of reasons, but yet wouldn't divulge any information. He also kept referring to the Women Equalities Minister and said that she would actually be able to answer all the questions. So, Mr. Speaker, did at any point did the government discuss who was the most appropriate person to bring forward this statement so that we could actually, as honourable members, question the government properly and ask somebody that actually had some knowledge to be able to answer questions?
Right. We're going to have to make some No, I'm going to come. It's slightly separate, so don't worry. What I want to do is to try and say, look, in an ideal world, yes, it will be easier. It is now live and I hope that it should have been emailed to certain members to ensure that they can see it. Don't shake your head just yet, just check if you want that to be helpful. What I would say is, we could argue that the Secretary of State has set it out for over an hour in which he answered the question, which answered the question on. But what I want to do is ensure that this debate goes ahead. We could have put it off to tomorrow, and quite rightly you wanted it today, which is important. So I'm going to go ahead. It's not the best way to start the debate. I do ask you to check. I am assured it is online and is available for members to do. But I do want to do this next very important point of order, which I've been waiting. Mr. Flynn, do you want to come in on this bit? Because I do want to separate the two.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have many skills at my disposal, but the ability to speak whilst also looking at the government's statement of reasons is certainly not one of them. I think it is entirely unfair for me as an elected member in this House to partake in a debate which you have kindly granted, and I appreciate that, without being in full possession of the facts. That is not my fault, Mr. Speaker. That is the fault of the Secretary of State for Scotland, who, whilst undermining Scotland's devolution, he's not just undermining Scotland's devolution, Mr. Speaker, he's undermining this place, and that is of serious consequence to you, I imagine.
No, I'm going to answer that point of order first, I think. What I would say is that this isn't the end. This is the beginning. There will be lots of opportunities where this will further be discussed. But I want to make sure this debate starts, and it's important that you do lay out the facts. Hopefully during this time you will have been started to read it. What I want to do is deal with the point of order from Amy Callan, who's quite rightly been waiting, and I wanted to separate the two issues because I do believe it's an important point.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I seek your advice as to what options are open to correct the record after the member for Stoke-on-Trent North, who is no longer in his place, spread misinformation in his question that people in this House and in Holyrood are inciting violence on the issue of the GRR.
That's disgraceful.
That is a matter of opinion, but what I would say, and I really do recommend that members are very careful in the language that they use, and it is important that we show tolerance, but more importantly, that we show respect to each other, and nothing should inflame the tensions that will already be running high. So I thank the honourable member for raising that point with me. I do say to all members, please think long and hard before you speak, because messages that you say in this House can be reflected in a way that I do not wish to see. Right. Let us... Oh, sorry, I forgot about you, Mr. Christopher Joe.
Mr. Speaker, this is a relatively trivial point of order compared with the previous ones, but nevertheless it relates to the procedures in this House. And you were present in the chair during topical questions today, and you would have heard the Energy Minister seemingly criticise me for not having given prior notice of the topical question which I chose to ask. I had originally in mind to ask a different question, but because that earlier question had already been answered, I thought it would be perfectly reasonable to choose another topical subject, and I was disappointed that my right honourable friend did not know the answer, because there is a lot of evidence come out recently that there has been a 15-fold increase in the number of household fires in 2022 caused by solar panels, and I'm surprised that the Minister didn't know anything about it.
The Minister wants to... In which case I'll answer it for you. And of course you can ask any question. That's the whole idea of topical, is to keep the Minister alive and on his feet. It's not for me to apologise when a Minister cannot answer. Let's leave it at that. Is it on something I've already ruled? If it's the word I've already ruled, I want to make progress. If it's completely different, I'll judge in a second, please.
I was just wanting to ask, Mr. Speaker, that given that we're going to go into this debate and haven't seen the stuff, will you give us a measure of flexibility if we need to nip out to get a copy, because we haven't seen it, and then still allow us to speak, even if we maybe miss a few seconds of the debate?
I'm sure we can even bring the copies in for you. In fact, I do see that Mr. Halsey is already doing due diligence in delivering, and quite rightly too. We now come to the emergency debate. I call the Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn, to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. here we have it. Here we have it, eventually. And I'm expected to read this whilst also speaking. I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, there is a real temptation for me to stand here and read every single word of this into the record right now. They want me to, Mr. Speaker. They probably shouldn't goad me to. They probably, I will, and I'll come back to that, Mr. Speaker. On a more serious note, calm down. On a more serious note, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with an apology. An apology to those people, and I think this should apply to everyone, irrespective of your views and respect of the GRR. An apology to those people whose hopes and whose aspirations for the future, who have fought so hard for a piece of legislation for so long, that they now see that that hope is being taken away from them. And it is being taken away from them by a government that they didn't vote for, that we haven't voted for since 1955. And, Mr. Speaker, this goes to the heart of this very issue, because this issue, at its very core, is about democracy on these islands and what democracy looks like on these islands within this United Kingdom. In Scotland's democratically elected Parliament in Holyrood, legislation has been passed which relates directly to a devolved competency. That legislation, the GRR Bill, is the most consulted upon legislation in the history of the Scottish Parliament. That legislation received support, not just from the Scottish National Party, but from the Labour Party in Scotland, Conservative Party members in Scotland, including the Right Honourable Member for Murray's predecessor, as I understand it to be the case. In a moment. It received support from the Liberal Democrats in Scotland, and it received support from the Greens in Scotland. In totality, it received support from nearly two-thirds of Scotland's democratically elected Parliament in Holyrood. It is an outrage, Mr. Speaker, that we have a situation in this United Kingdom where this government is seeking to overturn the mandate and the legislation put down by the people in our Parliament in Scotland. I will.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and just to give him a wee chance to look at even the first page of the reasons for this appalling decision. My honourable friend spoke earlier about the World Health Organisation and the other European and Commonwealth nations who have this legislation already, and how Scotland would be brought into line with that. And this statement says removing a number of measures which the UK Government regards as important safeguards are the very measures. Perhaps if the honourable gentleman wants to pipe down and listen, he might learn something. And these measures, which include the medicalisation of the process and indeed the breach of human rights, which include having to a trans person having to present themselves to a panel just to justify their existence, are the very things that we sought to remove because it made the rights of trans people so affected.
I thank my honourable friend for that worthwhile contribution. I didn't hear all of it in its entirety because of some of the rabid gammon to my right-hand side, but it was nonetheless an incredibly important point to make. And it's actually important, I will in a moment, it's actually important to reflect upon that, because we heard during the question session when the Secretary of State was talking, Mr. Speaker, and some of the questions that were coming from Conservative backbenchers in and around rerunning the debate that's actually happened already in Holyrood. We've had numerous members on the Conservative benches suggesting that they oppose the GRR for a number of different reasons. But those reasons have already been exhausted in Scotland's democratically elected Parliament. If members on those benches have issues with what the Scottish Parliament has put forward, they should perhaps jump on a train, go to Scotland, get themselves elected in Scotland to the Scottish Parliament and tried to change legislation there, rather than using this place to overturn Scotland's democratically elected Parliament. I'll give way to my honourable member for command.
I thank him for giving way. He rightly said that the GRR bill passed with cross-party support at Holyrood, including some Conservative MSPs. Now, one of the Conservative MSPs was Jamie Green, the Conservative Party spokesperson for Justice. Now, given his role, he showed good courage to vote for that. But isn't it the case that his leader, the only member for Moray, has just sold Jamie Green down the river?
I entirely agree, and perhaps the honourable member for Murray would like to address that point himself.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. When he's speaking about people who have supported and opposed the bill, can he confirm that a Scottish Government Justice Minister resigned her position to oppose the bill, a former Scottish Government SNP Cabinet Secretary voted against it, and in total 9 SNP MSPs felt this legislation was deeply flawed, was wrong, and they voted against it?
Mr. Speaker, the member, whilst he sits in this chamber, of course, already sits in Holyrood as well, and he will be familiar with the fact that the majority, the overwhelming majority of parliamentarians elected to Holyrood voted in favour of this legislation. Now, I appreciate that he lost that debate in Holyrood, but he should not be supportive of this government trying to overturn that decision. And I would be really interested to hear about the conversations that he's had with his elected colleagues in Holyrood about this particular decision.
Of course, and I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving me a second time. Of course, I have had conversations because I was the only party leader in Scotland to make this a free vote, to allow members of my party to come to a conclusion, as Jamie Green did. Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP refused to do that, which is why she lost government ministers as a result.
So, if we're going to talk about losing, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman lost the debate in Scotland, and I will repeat once again, it is not democratic to try and overturn that legislation here in this place. I'm not going to give way. No, I want to make a little bit of progress. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's been inferred by some members on the Conservative benches opposite that this is in some way in conflict with the Equalities Act. Indeed, I'm sure that within this tome before me that is the case. But yet there's senior members on those benches who've also been vocal about the fact that it doesn't intervene or overturn the Equalities Act in any way, shape or form. So, which one is it? Of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I ask him, does he find it, does he agree with me and find it ridiculous that the Conservative Party keep claiming that they want to protect women and children's rights, given the fact that just last night this government undermined workers' rights? They want to get rid of the Human Rights Act, they introduced the rape clause, and they want to remove us from the European Court of Human Rights. Is it not the case that if you want to defend rights, you get them as far away from this law as possible?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend has made an incredibly important point in respect of that legislation last night. Because it's not just in relation to the GRR where the UK government is seeking to overturn and ignore Scotland's democratically elected politicians. That's also true of last night's legislation in relation to the right to strike. Because, and I'm not making any grand assumptions here, I would assume with wholehearted confidence that an overwhelming majority of parliamentarians in Holyrood would be opposed to the legislation that is being put forward by the UK government in terms of the right to strike. But, Mr. Speaker, that is going to be ignored too. Just as on Wednesday, tomorrow, we're going to have legislation before this House in relation to the 4,000 pieces of EU legislation which this UK government wants to throw into the wind. Legislation which puts our food standards at risk. Legislation that puts workers' rights at risk. Legislation that puts overwhelming power in the hands of Tory ministers unelected in Scotland, of course, to do as they please. Now, the Scottish Parliament has been clear once again that it opposes that, Mr. Speaker. But yet that too is going to be ignored. Scotland's democracy ignored and ignored. Indeed, I will.
grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and of course he's making the powerful point about the fact that this is, in its core, just an attack on the rights of the people and the Scottish Parliament. But these comments that he's just made about the attacks on the Parliament have also been repeated and echoed by the Welsh Labour First Minister Mark Drakeford, who's called this intervention today, this Section 35 interference, he's called that a dangerous move. Isn't it the case that there's a deafness, not only in this place, but on those benches next to us from the Labour Party, about how dangerous these moves are for democracy across the nations of the UK?
Mr Speaker, and it appears that Mark Drakeford has more of a backbone than the vast majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party put together, and they could do well to learn from his views in respect of that. But, Mr Speaker, I was making the point that democracy matters and that this UK Government is seeking to consistently ignore Scotland's democracy. I mentioned the right to strike, and of course I mentioned the EU retained law bill. But it's also true in respect of Brexit as a whole. 72% of Scots want to rejoin the European Union, yet this UK Government, and indeed this Labour Party, have absolutely no interest in that position whatsoever. Of course I will.
I know he's not had an opportunity to look at the statement of reasons, because it's 57 paragraphs of which you have just been served up. I've had a quick chance to have a look at this. And can I say to my honourable friend, maybe not bother having a look at this in any great detail, because it's specious, it's hypothetical and it's poorly informed. And one example of that, Mr Speaker, is on equal pay. You seem to believe that a trans man would take advantage of the opportunity to be paid less. That's the type of rubbish that's included in this. What does you think of that?
Mr Speaker, I've not obviously had the opportunity to look at that myself, but if that is the case, it is a complete and utter embarrassment. And it shows that just as this Secretary of State was unprepared today in relation to this matter, so too is his government in relation to the arguments that they are putting forward. I'm a little bit embarrassed for them in this regard. Of course I'll give them.
And he's been incredibly generous. And I just want to point out on page 1.4 one point that I think is particularly concerning, and it says in relation to those points that the government are trying to take out of the legislation that they have concerns with. Taken together, these amendments remove any requirement for third-party verification or evidence from the process. Now, if I'm not wrong, when I came out, I did not have to seek verification from anybody to be a lesbian. So I do not understand why we are treating trans people as if they are applying for some kind of arbitrary, inanimate thing. You know, this is about their identity, it's about their lives, and it's about their livelihoods, and we should treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve.
Mr Speaker, you'll be unsurprised to know that I very much agree in that regard. But if I may return to the points I was making in respect of democracy. No, in relation to democracy, as I said, the right to strike, the EU legislation, Brexit, but also importantly, Mr Speaker, Scotland's right to choose. As we found towards the end of last year, and if the Father of the House wishes to awaken from his slumber, no, Mr Speaker, he does not appear to awaken from his slumber. Very distracting to see that in front of you in a democratically elected Parliament, Mr Speaker. If we are to reflect upon democracy, Scotland last year was denied its right to choose. Its right to choose by this UK Government. Now, the Supreme Court was clear that we don't have the power under the constitutional settlement to have a second independence referendum, irrespective of the views of the people of Scotland. And yet the only answer that this UK Government can give to any question in relation to that is no. No, you cannot have your say. So no matter which way we turn, no matter which issue it is of the day, this UK Government is not interested in Scotland's democracy. But, Mr Speaker, let's look in closer detail at the Conservative Party position in relation to that. When it... I'll give way.
I think we're For giving way, is it not the case that these statement of reasons clearly state that the government does not have any legal basis on which to challenge this legislation, and the simple fact is that the Secretary of State for Scotland has opened himself up to judicial review of this because he will simply find that he has no modification of the existing Equality Act, and there is no examples within this outline that indicate where he has justifiable reasons for outlining this Section 35 order. None. None. Here.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Secretary of State has opened himself up to many things, ridicule amongst them, of course, for his failure to see the blindingly obvious. But if I may just revert back to my previous point in respect of the wider Conservative position in relation to this, let us be clear, and in no doubt whatsoever, that the Conservatives are seeking to utilise this issue for a culture war. Nothing more and nothing less. Because this is the dying embers of a failing government that sees the polls, that knows that it's on its way out, that knows that members are going to lose their seats. And in a last gasp attempt to create division, they are using some of the most vulnerable people in society to create a culture war. Absolutely, I would.
Honourable friend's very kind. He's absolutely right on that point, and we were accused earlier on in the debate in the SNP of trying to use this as a vehicle to create a constitutional schism and conflict. But in actual fact, the SNP, like all the other parties in Holyrood that voted this through in the Scottish Parliament, had a mandate from the electorate in Scotland. Is he concerned, like I am, that that government over there has no mandate from anybody for this action that they're taking?
I absolutely share the views of my honourable friend. I am deeply concerned about that, and also deeply concerned about the culture war that they are seeking to stoke, Mr. Speaker. But let's also importantly reflect upon what we have here. It's a Conservative government which, as I said, hasn't been elected in Scotland since 1955. But it's perhaps most intriguing that what we have, Mr. Speaker, is a Secretary of State for Scotland who we know in the coming months will be walking out of this place, but he'll not be walking anywhere else but along to the undemocratic House of Lords. Mr. Speaker, Baron Jack, as he will come to be known, is trying to tell Scotland's democratically elected parliamentarians what they can and can't do, whilst at the same time knowing that he is going to end up in an unelected chamber. Shame on him and shame on his Conservative colleagues. I will give way, yeah.
Why does the honourable gentleman think the Gender Recognition Act has been such a protracted dispute in the Scottish Parliament and has so divided the Scottish National Party?
I don't actually agree with him on this, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a healthy thing in democracy for discussion to be had within a parliament. And that's exactly what's happened in Holyrood. And it may have escaped his notice, but I will repeat it, because parliamentarians from each and every party in Holyrood voted in favour of this legislation. And the question to him and his colleagues is why they are seeking to overturn Scotland's democratic view in this way. And I'm more than happy to invite him back in to answer on that specific point. He's not interested in answering on that specific. I've been very generous so far, Mr. Speaker. But of course, this isn't just about the Conservatives. This is about the Labour Party too. Should they rise from their seats and remove the splinters on this particular topic? Because this is the party who released a document last year from Gordon Brown which was meant to put devolution front and centre, something which critics like myself said, we've all heard it before, it's not going to happen. And when Scotland's Parliament is under attack from Westminster, where are the Labour Party? Nowhere to be found.
Very gratefully, this is the final time I'll intervene on the honourable gentleman. I wonder if he can tell us, do all his SNP MPs here in the UK Parliament support the SNP's Gender Recognition Reform Act?
I tell you what my colleagues support, Mr. Speaker, and that is enabling the people of Scotland to make decisions over their future without interference from his Westminster government. So, Mr. Speaker, we've heard it all from the Conservatives before in terms of their culture war. We know that the Labour Party are rowing back under the Leader of the Opposition from their support for the LGBTQ+ community in relation to this specific topic. And it's deeply, deeply disappointing to hear that that is the case. And when we go to the Scottish electorate again, not only will we have a Labour Party which is against the biggest issue that dominates Scottish politics at this moment, Scottish independence. Not only are they against Scotland having its view in respect of our membership of the European Union, they are also supportive of the UK Parliament overriding Holyrood. Shame on them too, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I will, of course.
Grateful once again for my right honourable friend for giving way. Isn't the desperate political act of this Tory government grubbing around for one last dying ember of distraction and producing this vacuous document as an excuse, isn't it an example of desperation? But isn't it also an example, as he's been outlining, of desperation to get into power, that the Labour Party won't even take a position to support devolution, the devolution they were supposed to champion in the first place?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. And I'm absolutely confident that the people of Scotland will be watching and listening to Labour's position in relation to this. But let's not. I'm more than happy to let the honourable gentleman intervene if he so wishes. No, he doesn't. He doesn't wish to. He just wishes to chunter from a sedentary position, Mr. Speaker. But we heard. Yes, of course I did.
I'm listening to his argument, which appears to be about democracy, and in some respects I can see the power of his argument, but I'm a bit confused because it seems to me that the SNP, with representatives from Scotland, voted for the Scotland Act and for the Section 35 measures that are being used today, and that furthermore the fact that they can be used today in the UK Parliament is because the Scottish people voted to remain within the UK in a referendum just in 2014.
With all due respect, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member is missing the point. The democratically elected members in Scotland's Parliament have voted for legislation within a devolved competency, and the UK government, her party, are seeking to remove that or to block that legislation. That's simply not fair and it's not democratic, Mr. Speaker, in any way, shape or form. But what comes next? What comes next from these continual democratic the continual democratic deficit that we experience on these here islands? Well, I think it's actually time and it's incumbent for reasonable unionists, of which I think there are many. I don't see very many in front of me, Mr. Speaker, but which I think there are many in society, to come forward. Of course I'll continue.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. In part 2 of this big flabby document, the heading is Adverse Effects of Different GRC Regimes Across the UK. If there is no allowance of different GRC regimes, how come gender recognition is devolved in the first place?
Indeed, a very powerful and eloquent point from my honourable colleague, as always. But the point of what comes next is incredibly important. Where do we go? Where do we go when Scotland's Parliament and our views and our purpose is just being ignored by Westminster? What are we to do? What are people in Scotland how are they to respond to that? When are reasonable unionists going to stand up and say, you know what, this isn't on? If you believe in this union of equals, then you'll put the Scottish Parliament first. I don't see that. I don't hear that in Westminster. And this is the clearest example of that. And it's a very rare occurrence. I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. And he's making a really powerful speech and really bringing the real democratic deficit really front and centre for people. But as well as the huge disappointment that I'm sure we all feel at what the UK government, the Tory government are doing, is he disappointed if I tell him that the UK Labour Party will it is reported, not challenge this intervention at all, to the great disappointment of a number of their Scottish MSP colleagues, and that these colleagues of theirs are deeply disappointed, and no wonder that's the case.
Just as we are looking for reasonable unionists, Mr Speaker, they're clearly not found on these benches. And if the honourable member, the Shadow Secretary of State, wants to clarify that that's not the case, then he's more than happy to do so. I'll be unsurprised if he doesn't. But, Mr Speaker, the point I was making... Of course I will.
Reluctant to be goaded by the SNP, but nonetheless, here we are. Look, just to be clear, I certainly want to make sure that there is a proper gender recognition plan across the whole of the United Kingdom, because I'm sick and tired of people setting women's rights against trans people's rights. That's where I want to get to, and I'm looking for solutions to that problem, not anything else.
I do respect the sincerity with which the honourable member delivers his points in that regard, and I see other honourable members nodding. Well, if that's the case, I'm sure that the honourable member will support us, because we have a solution in Scotland. That solution is the legislation that has been put forward in the Scottish Parliament, which has received democratic support in the Scottish Parliament, in which this UK government is blocking. And he should share my anger and the anger of his, I hope, colleagues in the Scottish Parliament in relation to this particular point. But, Mr Speaker, it's a rarity in this place, and I'm sure she'll forgive me in this regard, that I agree with some of the comments for the member from Edinburgh. I can't quite Edinburgh West, Mr Speaker. But I think when we were hearing from her earlier in respect of the difficulty that this is causing her in respect of the union, that is the sort of voice that we need to hear at this moment in time from those reasonable unionists about where they seek to go. Because if this is a union of equals, as it is portrayed, if Scotland's Parliament is to be the most powerful devolved legislature in the world, as we are often told that it is, then why is this Section 35 order being used? Of course.
I'm grateful once again for him giving way. He's talking about reasonable unionists and said that he couldn't see any on these benches. But of course, there are reasonable unionists who have been on these benches. Would he be interested in the words of Jed Killen, former Labour MP, who said the idea that one man elected by 22,000 people can overturn the devolved legislation brought in by the Scottish Parliament and supported by the vast majority of our MSPs is outrageous and surely will not stand up in court.
Indeed, Mr Speaker, that is very much the case. And whilst we're on that point of reasonable unionists, I want to reflect upon the words of Donald Dewar in relation to the Scottish Parliament, Mr Speaker, because this is, after all, what we are talking about. He said, Walter Scott wrote that only a man with soul so dead could have no sense, no feel of his native land. For me, for any Scot, today is a proud moment, a new stage on a journey begun long ago and which has no end. This is a proud day for all of us. A Scottish Parliament, not an end, a means to a greater end. And those two are part of our mace. Woven into its symbolic thistles are four words: wisdom, justice, compassion, and integrity. Wisdom, justice, compassion, and integrity. Each of those words is reflected in the legislation brought forward in the Scottish Parliament. It's why it received overwhelming support from Scottish parliamentarians. It's why members from each and every party in the Scottish Parliament voted in favour of this legislation. And it is why it is so important that we stand up for Scotland's Parliament, that we stand up for Scotland's democracy, and that we ensure that the people of Scotland's views are heard in this place. And I sincerely hope, and I do say this, Mr Speaker, in all sincerity to the Secretary of State, I hope that he will reflect upon the damage that he seeks to do to his own union in this regard, that he vault faces, that he shows that he does respect Scotland's democracy, and that he allows this legislation to pass as it should. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Lamont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A short time ago, the Secretary of State for Scotland made a statement to this House regarding the Government's decision to exercise the Section 35 power of the Scotland Act with regard to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. Now, for the benefit of members who were not present at that statement, I shall summarise what action this Government is taking and why. Mr. Speaker, today the Secretary of State is making an order under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998 preventing the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill from proceeding to royal assent. As the Secretary of State has said, this is the first time the power has been exercised, and this is not a decision that has been taken lightly. However, it is a decision based on the legislation's consequences for the operation of reserved matters across Scotland, England and Wales, including on equality legislation. The Scottish Government's bill would introduce a number of changes around gender recognition in Scotland. These include reducing the minimum age a person can apply for a gender recognition certificate to 16, and removing the need for a medical diagnosis and evidence of having lived for 2 years in their acquired gender.
Is it acceptable, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister to read out the statement that has already been made, changing the order of some of the sentences?
It's up to the Minister what he wishes to say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will continue. The bill would also amend the UK-wide Gender Recognition Act 2004, which legislated for a single gender recognition system across the entirety of the United Kingdom. Now, it's this United Kingdom Government's assessment that the bill would have serious adverse impact, among other things, on the operation of the Equality Act 2010. Effects would include impacts on the operation of single-sex clubs, associations and schools, and protections such as equal pay. There are also significant complications from having different gender recognition regimes in the UK, and there is also a danger of allowing more fraudulent or bad faith applications. I'll give way to the honourable member.
The Minister for giving way. If he has regard to paragraph number 15 in what purports to be the statement of reasons, he will see that it states there, "It is practically and legally undesirable for all, including in particular the individual holder of the GRC, that a person will have one legal sex in Scotland and a different one in England, Wales and Northern Ireland." Is the Minister satisfied that this test of practicality and legal desirability or undesirability is one which is sufficient to meet the test set out in Section 35?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, well, we do have concerns. We believe the creation of the two different processes for legal gender recognition in different parts of the UK is going to create complications, which is why we have taken the action that we have. Now, if the honourable member does not agree with that assessment, with the reasons set out in our reasons paper, there is the opportunity to pray against the order, there is the opportunity to vote it down, there is the opportunity to judicial review the decision-making process. So there are other options open to the honourable member to raise those concerns. The government has taken its decision based on the legal advice that we have received. We stand by that decision. The Secretary of State stands by that decision. And honourable members opposite, if they disagree, have other options open to them to challenge that. Now, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe, and this government believes, that transgender people deserve our respect, our support and our understanding. We have a long-established, world-leading equality framework that protects everyone, including transgender people, from discrimination, harassment and victimisation, and advances equality of opportunity for all. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Section 35 power has always been part of the architecture of the devolution settlement because it is an integral part of the Scotland Act, as which we've heard already, all parties in this House supported at the time. It provides a sensible measure to ensure that the devolved legislation does not have adverse effects on reserved matters, including on equalities legislation. Now, as the Secretary of State has said, It is open to the Scottish Government to bring back an amended bill for reconsideration in the Scottish Parliament, which deals with the concerns that this Government and many, many others have raised about the legislation and the impact that it will have. I'll give way to the honourable member for Badenoch Spades.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister's given it away. The Government's got concerns. Well, there we have it. The Conservatives had their objections voted down in the Scottish Parliament, so he's using the device of Section 35. Quite honestly, the statement of reasons is not worth the paper it's written on. And he knows that he can use his parliamentary majority in any praying motion to strike down an act of the Scottish Parliament. What price Scottish democracy? What price the right of the Scottish Parliament to enact legislation based on the majority in that Parliament, based on a mandate given by the people of Scotland that this Government is going to throw away because this Government, this Parliament knows better. And equality of equals, Madam Deputy Speaker, you have to be joking.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have made clear repeatedly, the Scotland Act always intended that in these moments where there was unintended consequences of legislation being passed by the Scottish Parliament which impacted across the United Kingdom, Section 35 gives us the opportunity to act in this way. The letter from the Secretary of State to the First Minister is clear about the amendments that can be made to the bill to allow it to be approved by the Scottish Parliament and to meet the concerns in terms of the impact it's going to have to other parts of the UK. We very much want to work with the Scottish Government constructively to secure those amendments to that bill to ensure the legislation can pass which meets our concerns. So we do hope the First Minister and the Scottish Government will bring back the amended bill for reconsideration by the Scottish Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the members opposite, the right honourable and honourable members opposite, will acknowledge that the United Kingdom Government has set out its desire to work together with the Scottish Government so we can find a constructive way forward to amend this bill so that it can pass by the Scottish Government and reach royal assent. Thank you.
Shadow Secretary of State, Scotland, Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think the time that the Minister took when responding to the SO24 shows you that the Government really don't have very much to say on this particular issue. Or maybe he didn't get the statement of reasons either in terms of what the Government were actually proposing. Can I start, Madam Deputy Speaker, by just restating again that this Labour Party is the party of devolution and the party of equality. And it won't be lost on many that the two bills that we're debating today, the Scotland Act and the Equalities Act, and indeed the Gender Recognition Act, are all Labour Party bills that we brought in the advancement of devolution and equality in this country. And it's very difficult to conclude anything other than today's debate being about two governments who are incapable of working together. I read and skimmed the 13 pages of the reasons. I mean, the farce that we've had to even try and get these reasons today as part of this debate. And when I got to the end, my initial reaction was, well, what is the government going to do about it? Because they can't just bring an unprecedented Section 35 order to this House to then lay out reasons, but then get to the end of those reasons and decide what we're going to do about it. As we stand here today, the Gender Recognition Bill in Scotland is dead unless both governments can come together and resolve the issues or perceived issues or otherwise. I'm happy to.
I just wonder whether my honourable friend has looked at paragraph 3, I think it is, because the Minister who was not taking interventions earlier, was suggesting that all the government has to do in Scotland is bring forward a bill with amendments. So far as I can see, it would have to come forward with a bill that doesn't have anything in it. That's the only bill that the Westminster government would accept, isn't it? If you go by these, the amendments suggested in paragraph 3.
That's where we get to the crux of this process. My honourable friend from Rhondda made a similar point earlier about wanting to make sure that trans rights and women's rights are protected in this country and doing it properly. And this is certainly not the way to do it. So we now have a process whereby I suspect and we know the First Minister and the Scottish Government will take the UK Government to court on the basis of these reasons and their unseen legal advice. And then the courts will have to decide if these reasons that they've put forward are actually legitimate and indeed reasonable in terms of the bar they have to reach, that there would be adverse consequences on reserved legislation. And I think, in actual fact, at the end of that process, we might be in a situation whereby the courts are going to have to decide to resolve these arguments because both governments are unwilling to do so together. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Is he concerned, like me, that gender recognition is devolved, and yet half of the blather in here is that it conflicts with the 2004 Act? That's the whole point of devolution, is that you can actually change legislation in Scotland in a devolved policy area.
It's a very helpful intervention, because it is the case that the first Section 14, the first category of adverse effects, talks about different regimes across the United Kingdom. Well, that to me suggests that the government doesn't want this devolved. There are other issues such as abortion and other issues that would have cross-border implications that are devolved. But I would gently just say, and also in response to the Honourable Lady, that Donald Deere designed Section 35 for the very question she has just asked. It was to allow the Scottish, but well, I mean, she does say, now, if you don't mind me repeating, but not for this issue, Donald Deere didn't envisage all the issues that would come through. Devolution was always a journey for the Labour Party and will continue to be so. But the key point, I think, in making in this is that Section 35 was put there to enable the Scottish Parliament to be able to legislate in devolved areas that may have an impact on the rest of the UK, but Section 35 was to be used as a last resort, is what it says, for when there might be some conflict. So if the first adverse effect in the paper is that they don't want different circumstances under gender recognition certificates between Scotland and the rest of the UK, then surely they're saying it should not be devolved. I'm happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way. I agree with a lot of the points he's making on devolution. So obviously he's read what really we should be calling the clutching at straws reasons rather than a statement of reasons. He mentioned a judicial review. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure him, like me, can read this and just see how weak these UK government arguments are. So on that basis, and if he believes in the protection of devolution, that Scotland should be able to do things differently, surely he agrees with us that the UK government should drop this action now, and actually the Labour Party should be full square behind the Scottish Parliament on this.
But the point that the Honourable Gentleman forgets is this is going to end up in the courts regardless, because the Section 35 has been brought forward. Anybody who prays against the Section 35 gets a debate and a vote. The vote's not going to be won. You said yourself they have a majority of 80, a working majority of perhaps 100 on this issue, and therefore it will have to be settled in the court. And can I just say that as much as I don't want this constitutional battle to be on the backs of trans people and women's rights as well, it would be quite good if the courts did settle these issues, because maybe we could move on with substance and do what is right by trans people for equality in this country. I was going to give way to the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland.
To the Minister, the Shadow Minister, for giving way, because can I take him to paragraph number 20 in the purported statement of reasons, where it says that one of the barriers that would be encountered is existing IT infrastructure. Can the Honourable Gentleman tell me if he's ever come across a case before where apparently law has to be designed to fit IT infrastructure rather than IT infrastructure being designed to fit the law?
Well, it's a valuable intervention. I'm glad, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm getting all the questions on these adverse effects, when in actual fact it's the government's document. But you're absolutely right. And what I think we've missed in this entire debate over the last few months is the fact that people in this country currently have gender recognition certificates, just under a different process where IT systems have to deal with that particular purpose. So how you get to a gender recognition certificate is the argument here, not how you implement it, because we implement them already.
I'm very grateful. Just on the substance and on the issue of how you get a gender recognition certificate, for me one of the key things is that we take this suggestion that it's a pathology out of the process. I don't want it to feel like we are treating trans people as if they have a pathological condition. Isn't that the key thing that we need to change?
Yes, I agree, and that should be part of this argument, and we should be taking the pathology office out of this. This isn't a medical disorder. that we're dealing with here, and that should be part of the discussion. But of course, all of these, I wish we were having a debate about all these things, because actually we should be, rather than having a constitutional debate between two governments that don't want to resolve these issues but want to fight about it in different ways. Yes, I'm happy to give way if Madam Deputy Speaker allows me.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister, and he's seeking to cast this conflict or tension, whatever you want to call it, as being between two governments. But in actual fact, dependent on how the Labour Party decide to act, this is a conflict and a tension between two parliaments, because there is cross-party support for this bill in the Scottish Parliament from the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the SNP and the Scottish Labour Party, whereas in this House it's simply the Conservatives who are standing in the way of this. Can he advise how the Labour Party will move on this?
But the honourable gentleman is completely and utterly fundamentally wrong about that point. What we're dealing with today is a debate between the UK and Scottish Government. This is what's in the legislation of the Scotland Act of 1998. So what we're actually dealing with today is a debate between two well, it has to be resolved by the two governments. You can't, if you want the Labour Party to try and resolve this, then we're happy to take the seats of government either in the Scottish Parliament or here, but it's got to be resolved by the UK and Scottish governments. That's the black and white of this particular issue. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady whilst his colleague is chuntering in the background nonsense.
Tim, for giving way, and I've been interested in how he has characterised some of what we've heard today, but I need to say to him that the Labour Party, if they see that they don't have a role in this, if he doesn't think that they ought to have a view or an opinion or take a position, then he needs to make that very clear, because his colleagues in the Scottish Parliament do have a view. They did vote for these provisions, as did members of the SNP, members of the Liberal Democrats, and indeed some Scottish Conservatives. So I think he should stop being, I think, a bit disingenuous and be clear where the Labour Party stand on this. Are they going to defend the rights of the Scottish Parliament to act or not?
Well, I'll tell you exactly where we stand. We want this legislation to work. At this moment in time, the legislation at this moment in time is dead. And it's dead because, well, the Honourable Lady says from centre position because of them. The bottom line here is that, and the Honourable Member for Aberdeen South quoted Donald Dewar at great length, and Donald Dewar will be turning in his grave at the moment in terms of what's going on in terms of devolution in Scottish politics. But Donald Dewar created the Section 35 process for the very reasons the Honourable Lady has just said. It's a process to enable cross-border problems to be resolved. Now, let me finish the previous point first. Now, the government have come forward with 13 pages that they think adversely affects UK-wide legislation. I think it's thin. I haven't had a chance to look at it straight the way through. Well, it might be rubbish, but there are concerns that people have had that we either have to alleviate or bring people with them. What the SNP have forgotten about this entire process, and we're very experienced at this because we do it all the time, when you're doing major equalities legislation, you've got to bring people with you. And if it means that we've got to get people round the table... No, you shouldn't bring people with you. So if people raise concerns, you should just say you should just dismiss them. No, this is me saying it. Equalities legislation is difficult, and you've got to bring people with you. Now, these adverse effects might be rubbish. I think, as I've already said, at initial glance, I think they are pretty weak and pretty flimsy. But the courts are going to have to decide whether we like this or not, because that's where it's going to go. Well, and the Scottish Parliament have the right to pass this legislation because it's devolved. But also the Scotland Act protecting the Scottish Parliament has a mechanism in there written by Donald Dewar to ensure if there are cross-border concerns, those are dealt with. And that's the way it is in terms of this particular process. Madam Deputy Speaker, I haven't gone even through the first bit. Well, I'm going to give way to the honourable gentleman if he will apologise for saying we were weasels before, and I hope he's gone back and read my speech, which is not what I said during my contribution during the statement.
With the greatest respect, what I'm hearing from him now is that he neither supports the position of the Scottish Parliament, nor does he support the position of the government, and he says we need to win public support. How much public support has the Labour Party got in Scotland? And isn't this the problem he's got to face? Leaving himself with nowhere to stand in Scottish politics and falling between stools is hardly standing up for the devolution settlement, of which he should be so proud that Donald Dewar established.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's quite obvious that the honourable gentleman didn't listen to my contribution during the statement and hasn't listened to my contribution since. So I had no idea which debate he's listening to, but it's certainly not the one that I'm participating in at this particular moment in time. Madam Deputy Speaker, the bottom line here is, and this is the undeniable fact whether we like it or not, the only way to resolve this today will be for either both governments to come together to try and find an accommodation, and I'm surprised they haven't done so. This has been on the card since 2016, and all we're getting now is a statement of adverse effects 1 day, 24 hours before the expiry period of when the bill is supposed to get royal assent. So coming in at the 11th hour with a Section 35, with 13 pages of adverse effects that haven't been communicated or worked with the Scottish Government before. Now, I've no doubt the Scottish Government, I'm not involved in detailed discussions at ministerial level, perhaps the Labour Party will be at some point in the future, but maybe it takes two to tangle in these discussions. But if you genuinely want this legislation through, and the Government genuinely want to try and see if there is any adverse effects that could affect residents in England, Wales and Northern Ireland that aren't part of the Scottish Gender Recognition Act, then isn't it incumbent on both governments to get together and do everything they possibly can to try and resolve this so we can get it on the statute book? Section 35 can be removed and it can go for royal assent as was supposed to have happened some time ago. And that's the grim reality in Scottish politics at the moment. It's happened with the Children's Rights Bill, where the UK Government challenged the Children's Rights Bill through the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that certain aspects of the Children's Rights Bill had overreached under Section 33 of the Scotland Act, and another one of Donald Dewar's sections that he wrote in to protect devolution. And the Scottish Government was asked to remove those sections and the bill would get royal assent, and 2.5 years later nothing has been done. And that just shows you that we are just in this political paralysis in Scotland at the moment where nobody can do anything because it's turned into political football about the Constitution, and the trans community and others are sitting there in disbelief today that that is not going to be able to be taken. Let me just make some progress. I wanted, Madam Deputy Speaker, because of accusations that had been made, just to go through a little bit of what the Scottish Labour Party's response to the bill was in the Scottish Parliament. We had a multitude of concerns with the initial bill, and nobody could have said that the initial bill that was presented and drafted to the Scottish Parliament was in any way fit to become final legislation. But we worked constructively with the legislation, constructively with the UN Rapporteur for Women and Girls, constructively with the LGBTQ+ community, and constructively with women's groups who had concerns that they were raising about the bill, and we did put forward amendments. We got the Equality Act on the face of the bill, which is referred to in a lot of the adverse effects in the government's document, and we did get many other amendments to that bill to help alleviate some of the concerns with the initial part of the bill. But the only way we're going to settle these arguments now is, unfortunately, through the courts. I'm happy to give way to the Leader of the Scottish Conservatives.
Grateful to the Shadow Scottish Secretary for giving way. His UK leader said at the weekend that he has serious concerns about reducing the age from 18 to 16. However, when my Scottish Conservative colleague Rachel Hamilton brought forward an amendment to keep the age at 18 rather than reducing it to 16, Labour MSPs joined with the SNP to vote that amendment down. What's his position on the age limit in Scotland?
Yeah, but we put in protections on the age limit in Scotland. And can I just say to the honourable gentleman, we've got one party in here, the leader of the SNP, accusing the Scottish Labour Party and the UK Labour Party of different positions on this. There's nothing between the different positions, but devolution. But we should have devolution at the same time. Now, Keir's made it perfectly clear, but Anas Sarwar and his team got significant protections in terms of 16 and 17-year-olds, including the notary public issue, which means you have to swear in front of a notary public in order for this to take effect, and you have to get a responsible adult over the age of 18 in order to be able to do any of this under the age of 18. So what the honourable gentleman is essentially challenging people on is not to have different views on it, and two of his own front bench MSPs voted for the legislation. So people are entitled to have a slightly different view on what is an incredibly important subject. And, you know, The only thing that the honourable gentleman managed to do in the last week, not get both governments together to try and resolve this, was to write to me to ask my position on this bill. Well, I would rather they came together. Well, we want this bill passed, and we want the Section 35 resolved. It's as simple and straightforward as that. And you know, we've had a position for some time to modernise the GRA. We've already had the position eloquently expressed by the member for Rhondda, and that position is still the position that we currently have. And can I just say to the member, to the government, in terms of the member for Leeds Central, I think he made the crucial point, and it goes back to the member that we had the intervention from as well. The Equality Act already exists with gender recognition certificates, and those spaces, particularly single-sex spaces, are protected under exemptions under the Equality Act as we currently sit here today. And the adverse reasons that the government are giving us in terms of that is not about the process of getting a GRC, but the process that is currently already in place. The government are all over the place on this, and it's little wonder that they're fanning the flames of people who wish to break up the United Kingdom as the only result to be able to do this. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've already said a number of times, I have to give way.
Isn't it right that in the passing of the Equalities Act, it was noted then that the GRA needed reform and it needed to be depathologized? The party that came in straight after the passing of the Equalities Act, the party currently in government, has spent over 13 years, or 12 and a bit years, fiddling their fingers, fanning the flames of fear and hatred on this. And then when one of the parliaments of this kingdom has taken decisive action, rather than stepping up and working to resolve it, instead they've constructed a constitutional crisis which will benefit their voting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think that's, from the honourable gentleman, that's what I've been saying. We desperately want the legislation passed, but we desperately want to make sure that the issues raised under the Section 35 are resolved, and there's only two ways to do that, either through the courts, which I think where this is heading, or for both governments to get together. We don't have the power to be able to do either that. Madam Speaker, let me finish with this, that opinion polling shows that the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland just want their two governments to work closely together in the interests of the country, and in this particular issue, in the interests of equality. So could I say to both governments, these issues are not irresolvable. We can create an environment where protections exist for women at the same time as strengthening the rights for trans people. We can create a legal framework where GRCs issued in Scotland are entirely compatible with UK-wide equalities legislation, and we can have a country where both the Scottish and UK governments act like grown-ups, get round the table and resolve these issues. That's what used to happen. That's the way in which Donald Dewar designed this legislation that this government are now implementing. And I think genuinely constructive discussions between both governments, let's lock them in a room until they find a resolution to this, and don't let them out till they find it. And I can assure you there's a way through this, but they're unwilling to take it.
Before I call the next speaker, just to say that this debate has to finish by 27 minutes past 5, so I'm introducing a time limit. I will start with 5 minutes, but it will go down after that if necessary. Douglas Ross.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I speak in this debate as someone who's extremely privileged to both serve in this Parliament and in the Scottish Parliament. So I'm able to bring some points of view which were not accurately articulated by the leader of the SNP, who is sadly leaving the chamber at the moment, because I think it is important, because I am referring to a number of the points he made. He speaks about the legal advice. We had the situation in the Scottish Parliament when the night before crucial amendments were being debated, Conservative MSPs, Labour MSPs and indeed SNP MSPs were written to by the Cabinet Secretary about their amendments and legal advice surrounding them, but were told that legal advice couldn't be shared. Yet here we have the UK Government sharing their statement of reasons with Parliament, and I think that's, well, it is based on legal advice, and I'm just showing the different approach by the government. It is based on legal advice. That was clear from the Scottish Secretary. And also, I think it is important to recall that although the SNP leader in this place and others have said this is a debate that has been raging in Scotland for over 6 years, that's absolutely correct. I've not yet heard, and I'm willing to take an intervention from any SNP member, that can explain to me why it had to be passed by December of last year, What was the rush in the lead up to Christmas that meant it had to go through the Scottish Parliament before the end of the year? I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm delighted to just remind the honourable gentleman, and we've heard this a few times already today, that this is the opposite of rushed legislation. This has been in the works for 6 years. This has been a repeated manifesto commitment of a number of parties, and it has been the most consulted upon piece of legislation.
Hear, hear.
You might more reasonably ask, why did it take as long as it did?
The point the Honourable Lady is missing is, yes, there has been that debate for 6 years. Why then did it have to go through stage 3 and looking at amendments until midnight one night and 1:30 in the morning for it to be rushed through before the end of the session? Surely, if there was that, I will give way in a moment, but surely, if there is that much debate, that much controversy, and remember, 150 amendments, if that legislation wasn't rushed, there wouldn't have been the need to look at 150 amendments. And I do yet wait to hear any SNP member saying why it had to be put through in December of last year. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Does he not recall that the debate in the Scottish Parliament went on till those hours and votes occurred at those hours because of his stalling?
Yeah. It wasn't stalling, and indeed, well, I'm sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker. Some people may say the 12 or 15 points of order we had earlier from SNP members was stalling. I don't believe that. I believe that was politicians making a point in Parliament. Just like in the Scottish Parliament, we were looking at 150 amendments because the SNP had rushed this through. And there's also been a lot made, and I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the honourable member. He raises the issue of 150 amendments. That's the point, because there was effective scrutiny that took place, and he, his colleagues and other parties put down these amendments, and they were looked at in the correct manner. And of course the Scottish Parliament had to take time to do that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we should be proud of that.
And I am. And that's why I wanted that debate. That's why I just make the point. Why couldn't we have continued that debate into the new year? What was the big issue that meant the SNP and the Greens were forcing this through by the end of the year? The last couple of points I want to make in the process in the Scottish Parliament is there's been a lot said, and the leader of the SNP refused to even acknowledge. But while there are members of all parties that supported this bill, there were a significant number of SNP opponents to the bill. SNP ministers resigned in Scotland as a result of this legislation. I'll give way in a moment. But what I would say is I gave my MSPs a free vote. I think that was right that they were given the opportunity. In fairness, one of our former colleagues in this place, Michelle Thompson, who's now an SNP MSP, spoke about the dark arts of the whips within her parties who were trying to stop debate. No, this was from Michelle Thompson. She used to be an SNP MP. She was speaking about the dark arts of her whips in this debate. And I'm just interested to know about the SNP MPs who oppose this legislation. I'm not sure if any of them are here today, but I'm sure the honourable gentleman will tell me that there are SNP MPs that oppose his government's Gender Recognition Reform Act.
Thank you for giving way. I don't beg to speak for the rest of my colleagues, and it is a matter for record that some SNP MSPs voted against the GRR. That did happen, but the point of democracy is it was the will of the Scottish Parliament as a whole, and it's the will of the Scottish Parliament that him and his government are trying to thwart.
No, we're not, and I'll come on to explain that in a moment. The last point I want to make is, again, the honourable gentleman who leads the SNP here spoke about this government taking a view on the Equality Act. I can only assume then, Madam Deputy Speaker, he is unaware of the letter to the SNP Minister who led this bill, Shona Robeson, from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, dated the 22nd of September last year, long before this bill came back to the Scottish Parliament, that said there was potential cross-border implications. Indeed, the Equality and Human Rights Commission said, in our view, there is an implication for the operation of the Equality Act 2020. This isn't the Conservatives or this UK government saying it. It is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they made that very clear to the Scottish Government and indeed to the SNP. I'm really sorry, I've now got 2 minutes left, so I apologise to the Honourable Lady. There is a lot I would like to get through here. I would have liked to have heard from the Liberal Democrat MP, because it does seem in both Holyrood and here, Liberal Democrat and Labour are supporting Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP on this. And I do worry that they are treating this issue in the same way they treated children and young people with the passing of the UN Convention on the Rights of Children Bill. We were told then it was absolutely essential legislation. They then legislated under the competencies of the UK Government, and the UK Government took the Scottish Government to court. That was controversial at the time. Nicola Sturgeon said it was an absolute outrage. Yet, having heard the ruling from the Supreme Court on the 6th of October 2021, with the Supreme Court saying that legislation was flawed, it went back to the Scottish Government and it went back to the Scottish Parliament. What has happened since the 6th of October 2021? Well, I can tell you. On the 1st of February 2022, the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, John Swinney, wrote to the Scottish Secretary and said they are looking to reintroduce this amended legislation to the Scottish Parliament. Given how important the UNCRC was to SNP members and the SNP government, can any SNP MP here today tell me when that bill will be introduced into the Scottish Parliament? I'll give way to the Honourable Lady if she can tell me.
I'm not sure whether he was aware, but over the last 2.5 years there was this thing called the COVID pandemic, which actually kept several governments fairly busy.
Not sure if the Honourable Lady perhaps hadn't heard me. I was saying there was a letter from the Deputy First Minister on the 6th of February 2022. So almost a year ago, we'd passed Omicron by then, and John Swinney was telling us that he would introduce that. This is another example, Deputy First Minister, of the SNP using legislation and vulnerable people to promote a battle between the UK and the Scottish Government. We can do far, far better than that.
Order. After the next speaker, I will drop the time limit to 4 minutes. Absolutely no problem with colleagues taking interventions, but do remember it leaves less time for others to speak. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my Highland colleague from Murray this afternoon. You know, we've heard a lot today about the passage of the Scotland Act, and it probably is worth reflecting that the Scottish Parliament has only been in existence since 1999, a very different Parliament from the one that we have here, one that's elected under very different systems, the list system that means it's very difficult for a party to achieve an overall majority. There have been 7 elections to our Parliament. The SNP have been in government in the last 4, and only one of those we've had a majority. And I think to answer some of the comments made by my friend from Edinburgh South is that the SNP government has always had to try and reach a compromise with other parties, has always tried to reach a consensus. And I think over the course of that 23-year period, it's worth reflecting on how much has been done by the Parliament across party on the subject of equalities. We can be proud of the journey that Scotland has been on. And my goodness, Madam Deputy Speaker, we can be proud of the bill that was passed just before Christmas that gives equality to trans people. Really something that should gladden the hearts of all of us. And when you recall what happened in that vote just before Christmas, MSPs from all parties voting for that legislation, a substantial majority of the Scottish Parliament. Of course, parties that were elected in the main with a manifesto commitment of delivering that legislation, and as has been referred to, a debate that took place over a 6-year period, and to hear people talking about that legislation being rushed, my goodness. But there's a very important principle here, because you look at the SNP benches, and we've been here in substantial numbers since 2015, and if I think back on everything that's gone on since that period and everything that's happened since the 2014 referendum, we've repeatedly been told that this is a family of nations, that Scotland was to lead the United Kingdom, that Scotland's Parliament was to be respected. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, how many times have we been here and seen that legislation has been passed without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, throwing away the Sewell Convention that's supposed to protect the rights of the Scottish Parliament in default areas to give consent? We've seen it in so many times. We've seen it in the European Withdrawal Act. We've seen it in the Single Market Act. We're seeing it in the legislation which is coming tomorrow on EU laws. But the biggest disgrace, we saw it yesterday, of course, over the issue of strikes. But let me make some progress, and I will. But we also need to think about what is happening here. Because this is a bill that's been passed by the Scottish Parliament, where the Scottish Parliament has legislative powers, where the Scottish Parliament has legitimacy. And the Secretary of State is using powers given to him under the Scotland Act to strike down an act of the Scottish Parliament, and why this scrap of paper is simply not worth what is written on it. This is not about interfering with the powers of the UK government and interfering with acts passed by the UK government. This is simply about interfering with the Scottish Parliament. And it makes that point to everybody back in Scotland, that our Parliament has been under attack ever since we've been here as an SNP group since 2015 in the numbers that we have. And this is just the latest example. The UK government could have gone to court if it wanted to in this. But it's using this legislation, the powers that the Secretary of State has, a man that's going to disappear from this chamber and end up in the unelected House of Lords, that can stop an act of the Scottish Parliament, that can strike down an act that's been passed by a majority of MSPs, to strike down a bill that has the support of members of every political party. What a disgrace. And the message to the people of Scotland: if you want to stop the Secretary of State for Scotland interfering in our Parliament, if you want to stop the UK Parliament denying our rights, denying our democracy, then, friends, come with us. Complete the journey. Scotland must become an independent nation.
Sir Peter Bottomley, Father.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to listen to the former parliamentary leader of the SNP. He at least did spend a bit more time on Section 33, more than his successor did. It's certainly true that there were three ways the UK government could approach this Scottish bill. One is to say it is deeply unpopular with many people in Scotland, do nothing about it and let the SNP take the political flak, which would probably reduce the number of members of the Scottish Parliament and SNP members in the UK Parliament at future elections. That would, to some people, be the political way forward. The better way forward is, if there's something substantial in the problems that this bill may create for the UK Equalities Act, is to take action either under Section 33 or under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998. I think the government had a choice. They've chosen to go for Section 35, and that's the right choice. And when the right honourable gentleman who's just spoken refers to what's happened since 2015, I remind him, I've reminded before, that in 2017 the SNP got 37% of the vote in Scotland, and the Conservatives got 44% of the vote in the country as a whole. I think we'll see how this works out. I think the best way forward, if I can give advice to everybody, is that we follow the suggestion from the Secretary of State to the First Minister that the governments get together and work out how to have a gender recognition bill in Scotland, which is compatible and obviously compatible with the Equalities Act, so that women don't feel that they're losing any kind of their security in any way whatsoever. I commend that to the House.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. You know, this is really a dark day for democracy. I think it's shameful that the UK Parliament and the so-called Secretary of State for Scotland, who I note is no longer in his place, would seek to override the democratically elected representatives who people in Scotland have sent to our national Parliament. It really does show complete contempt for the Scottish Parliament and for its ability to pass legislation within its areas of competence. So it's no exaggeration to call this out for what it is. It's a politically motivated assault on our democratic processes and our democratic institutions by a right-wing Tory party that has no compunction at all in using one of the most marginalised groups in our society to achieve its aims. And we need to remember what this is all about. It is about simplifying the process for people applying for a gender recognition certificate. That is all this is about. It doesn't change the effect of a gender recognition certificate. That remains the same as under the Gender Recognition Act 2004. It only seeks to improve and simplify the process by which a trans person can apply for legal recognition of their acquired gender. That's a right that's been in place for 18 years. And this bill passing represents an important step towards creating a more equal and fair Scotland, where LGBT people are valued and included and empowered. And I'm proud that the Scottish Parliament voted for that. And let's be clear, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill was passed overwhelmingly by the Scottish Parliament and by members from all parties, including the Tory party, and with the overwhelming support of SNP, Labour, Green and Liberal Democrat MSPs. And all of these parties, represented in Holyrood, apart from the Tories, had actually committed in their manifestos to improving gender recognition laws. The provisions, we've spoken about this, they're the most widely consulted upon in the history of the Parliament. And as well as the very broad and wide-ranging consultation, the Scottish Parliament's Equality, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee heard from people, including the Leader of the Irish Senate, about experiences with similar legislation there. And it's not only Ireland, we've heard about this today. These kind of measures are in place increasingly in countries across the world. This is not groundbreaking stuff. It's inconceivable to me that there is a good reason for us to be arguing about it. And we've heard about all these conversations that took place, we've heard about the amendments, we've heard about the way that it passed through Parliament with all of these conversations happening. So on any examination, this has been a very detailed and a very thorough process leading up to a very clear decision. And all of that within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. So why the UK Government, who's no friend of human rights in any guise, wants to step in, why they want to step in on this issue, which affects a marginalised group so much, is a mystery to me. It might be that the Secretary of State for Scotland has a different view to me on gender recognition reform, and that's his right, just as my views are my right. But what should not be his right, as one man, the soon-to-be Baron Jack, stepping forward and overriding the democratic voice of the Scottish Parliament, throwing his weight around just because he can. And I've read the statement of reasons now, and I still can't fathom what the basis is for this measure. But I think that whether it's on the Constitution or whether it's on the gender issue, I think that the court of the Secretary of State and the courts of the government actually are on a real sugary peg here. Whether we think about the Tory Reform Group and what they said, the chair of the Equalities Committee pointing out that this does not cut across equalities legislation, whether we look at what Andy McKeever has said. On all of these fronts, these people are making important points which should be listened to. But fundamental to all of that is the democratic point. The Scottish Parliament has voted for these measures and it's their right to do so.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to contribute to this debate as a passionate unionist, like many members on this side of the House. And I am concerned about any legislation that could undermine the settlement that we have within the Union of the United Kingdom. And I say this as a former Secretary of State that took a devolution bill through Parliament and was also in the Cabinet when the last Scotland Act went through Parliament as well. And having served in a devolved administration, what I understand the genuine objectives and the support that the devolved administrations hold. So the starting point, so the principle of one legislature intervening on another legislature is could be a very dangerous precedent. So my starting point in this debate would be to have sympathy with the Scottish nationalists, with what they are claiming, with what they're doing, and to understand the points in which some of them are making. That it could be a dangerous precedent. But Section 35, this is not about gender recognition. It is not about all of the sensitivities that are associated with that. This is about the process of good lawmaking, of providing clarity and providing satisfaction within the Equalities Act. And that is something that we all should be concerned about because of the people that would make use of the Equalities Act, because of their vulnerability and the appalling way some of these people will have been some of these individuals would have been dealt with previously. So the synthetic anger that comes from the benches opposite troubles me, because the reality is that they often refer to the courts in order to clarify the devolved settlement, and that is fine and in order and provides ultimate clarity. And this Section 35 order, we all know, will still end up in the courts. And so why so much synthetic anger around that? Because that will provide clarity to this as well. And if they have so much confidence in waving this document around saying that it is worthless, well, that will be the finding in the court. So let's at least concentrate on the good process of lawmaking where one legislature has respect for the other. And if there is a genuine concern, they should respond to the invitation made by the Secretary of State, where both leaders of legislatures can get together to debate and discuss and seek to deliver a positive outcome, because this is about the outcomes, not about the anger and the synthetic noises that have been made by the members opposite. So, and I then want to turn to the Labour Party, and I'm sorry that the Shadow Secretary of State is not in his place, because I am really disappointed by the approach that the Labour Party have been taking on this. They've been criticised and called different names, and legitimately so. And I say that with no gratification or pleasure or anything like that, because I thought the Labour Party was a unionist party and would want the law to be respected and Section 35 to be used for the very reason that they lay down. But the Shadow Secretary of State sought to manufacture all sorts of nonsense around this debate, rather than recognising the legitimate concerns that exist. Surely the Labour Party would want to see a good lawmaking process. So there is a time when process and principle matters to secure good legislation, but also, I would say to the Shadow Minister opposite, to secure the union as well.
Order. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member from Vale of Glamorgan, who says he's a unionist. I have no reason to doubt that, but I would assure him that I am as well. And I would like to assure not only the honourable member opposite, but the members of the government opposite and the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party that my objection to this, and my party's objection to this, is not to do with the fact that Section 35 exists. We think that that is a good check and balance. It's not to do with the right of the UK government to intervene when there is a genuine need for it. It is that this is not the time, it is not the case, and it is not appropriate. The Parliament of Scotland considered this very carefully. The honourable member for Murray talked about the letter which came pointing out potential differences, or potential problems, I beg your pardon, with the Act. I wonder if it occurred to him at all that in the year between that, or almost year between that letter arriving and the amendments being placed before Parliament, those were taken into account. That the legislation that was passed by the Scottish Parliament looked at every conceivable situation and took it into account. I asked the Secretary of State earlier if he could point out to me the section of the bill which undermines my rights as a woman, my daughter's rights as a woman, all the women I know, the children I know, and he didn't. But we have been directed to this document, this flimsy, weak apology of a statement of reason as the supposed justification for this Section 35, Order 35 intervention. And to say it's weak is to flatter it. Those of us on the opposition benches, and some who support the government, have looked at this bill in great detail. Our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament pored over it with a fine-tooth comb and considered 150 amendments. It says on the face of the bill that it will always guarantee the primacy of the Equalities Act. The Parliament of Scotland has made a decision, a considered decision. The elected representatives of the people of Scotland have made that decision on behalf of a very vulnerable section of our society. They have made progress towards a society where those people feel respected, honoured, treasured in a way that perhaps they had not done before. And I am grateful to my colleagues in the Scottish Parliament for having done that for my fellow Scots. And I have to say, I am disappointed in the government of the United Kingdom that they have taken this completely inappropriate opportunity to stage a constitutional crisis, a constitutional confrontation with the Scottish Parliament, because please be sure it is the Scottish Parliament. It is not the Scottish Government. And I would ask that they carefully reconsider the damage that they are about to do to the unionist cause in Scotland if they do not respect the wishes of the Scottish Parliament.
Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to support the Government's decision to use its Section 35 powers with respect to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill in Scotland. Now, like many other honourable members, I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to read this in full and in detail, so I will focus my remarks on a few key areas that I think are significantly important. Firstly, in paragraph 27, the Government rightly points out the bill does not create sufficient safeguards. And I think, indeed, the Government is very right to be concerned about fraudulent and malign applications, with the implications for child safeguarding. Now, this morning in the Education Select Committee, we had Professor Alexis Jay, who, of course, chaired the inquiry into institutional child sexual abuse. And it was harrowing to hear the stories of decades of child sexual abuse throughout institutions across this country. And there's one key feature of that abuse, which is that predators will exploit any loophole they can find to get access to children. And that is, I'm afraid, what will happen with this bill. We shouldn't be asking how easy is it for someone who's uncomfortable with their sex to obtain a GRC. We should be asking how easy is it for a predator to get access to children. And I'm afraid this bill would make it vastly easier for a predator to get access to children, to change their sex, to change their gender, with an eye to exploiting loopholes of accessing children and women in particular. No, I've only got 4 minutes. So. The naivety that this has been written with is absolutely astounding and hugely worrying. I think also the reduction of the age limit to 16 is a significant safeguarding risk. The human brain does not end development until about the age of 25. You can't drive a car when you're 16. There are an awful lot of things that you're not allowed to do legally when you're 16 because you cannot assess the long-term implications on your welfare. Changing your legal gender with a potential route to long-term changes to your fertility, your sexual function, your health is not suitable for 16-year-olds. There's a huge safeguarding risk. Paragraphs 30 and 48 mention membership on the grounds of sex in single-sex spaces. Sex Matters did a report recently looking at the impact on single-sex spaces and the ability of men to access them through changing their gender. The one thing women say is, I never went back. I never went back to that swimming pool. I never went back to that counselling class. For many women, the dignity of being a women-only space, of knowing that there are no men that are going to be there, is so important. We will see a chilling effect on important single-sex rights if this goes through. And I think, as a woman, I fully understand the threats to dignity and safety that this poses, because it will change the social contract. In this country, we recognise that in toilets and changing rooms, in public spaces, there are areas where only women are allowed. I had an experience recently in a restaurant where a man dressed as a woman walked into the toilets. I was on my own in the toilets. He stood behind me and stared at me into the mirror, looking at me in my eyes. Now, I have no idea if he intended me any harm, but my instinct, my evolved instinct as a woman, was to be frightened, because unlike almost any other species, women are far less powerful than men. We can't defend ourselves. That's why we have... No, it's a fact. The difference in strength between men and women is phenomenal. That's why we have separate sex categories for sport. Women are evolved to be wary of men in intimate spaces. That's why we have single-sex spaces. They must continue to exist for the safety and privacy of women. This threatens that social contract. Finally, it threatens the understanding of our law, which should be based on fact. And you cannot change your sex any more than you can change your place of birth or who your parents are. Now, I fully understand the complex arguments involved in this, and we should treat it with compassion. But if the law is not based on fact, then how can we trust the law? That is why the Government is absolutely right to serve this notice.
Order. Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Goodness me, that speech was probably one of the worst transphobic dog whistle speeches that I've heard in an awful long time. The idea of linking trans people with predators, frankly, is disgusting, and you should be ashamed.
No, calm down. Yes.
No.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Way to you, or anyone else, to the honourable member, Now, on the substance of this, ignoring that horrible speech that we have just heard, actually...
Order, Peter Bottomley.
Did the Chair hear anything transphobic in the previous speech?
I have to say to the Father of the House that different colleagues, different members of this House are going to interpret speeches in different ways. And I suggest that what we do is move on quickly. I think the honourable gentleman needs to calm down, moderate his language, and move on to the substance of the debate. Otherwise, I will ask him to resume his seat. Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is difficult when we're talking about these emotional matters, but the reality of this is, this Section 35 is the new Tories' Section 28. It is their continuation of a war against a group of people, their culture war, that they want to pursue. And they think it will advantage them in the polls. That's what the Australian Conservatives thought as well. That's what the Republicans in the US thought. But I trust it will not, because the people do not like the bigotry that we hear from the other side. So, what... It is bigotry. I will give way. It is bigotry what we just heard.
I recognise the individual feels...
Could I just say to the honourable gentleman that we are very short of time. I hope that if he takes an intervention, he will stick to the 4 minutes. Alicia Cairns.
I recognise that the honourable gentleman feels very strongly about this, but I would ask him to caution labelling a party as solely one thing, because it is the Conservative Party colleagues who have led for a conversion therapy ban that today has been announced. When I was elected, no other MP talked about it for 7 months, and we have today delivered it. So I would caution him, please do not label all members of certain sides of the House to be transphobic or homophobic, and I would also challenge that anyone should be labelled that within this House.
I will say that there are some very honourable members on all sides of the House, including on that side, who have resisted the moves from the government when trans conversion therapy was removed, pushed for it to get back in, and their work is to be applauded. But what this report says, in reality, is there is no amendment that this government would accept that they would allow to pass. What this flimsy piece of paper indicates is that the only bill that they would accept is the current UK law, and anything that deviates from it would be blocked. Well, I'm afraid that is an undermining of the very concept of devolution. Just be honest. Just be honest and come and say that you want to remove the devolved competencies of this area from the Scottish Parliament and you want to return them back to Westminster. At least that would be an honest debate, rather than this dog whistle debate around the safety of children, which frankly is not correct. Now, of course there will be concerns. Of course, this bill will not be perfect. No bill is perfect. But one of the key principles of my job, I think all of our jobs, is to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And let's see how this bill rolls out in Scotland. We could have seen the flaws that might have come from it, and then they could have amended it. The Scottish Parliament could have made the actions to amend, because all bills are living documents and practical. But instead, and I say this as a gay man who loves all male spaces sometimes, finds that actually the liberation of having those spaces is important, and I am sure that many women feel that the safety of all women's spaces is important to them. But this bill does not change that law one bit. GRC certificates exist at the moment. We have already a system where you can change your passport and your driving licence without a GRC certificate. Going into a toilet or a public facility or a refuge is not contingent on a certificate at all. So all of those arguments are bogus. And to continue a bogus argument, knowing that it is bogus, is, I'm afraid, a form of bigotry.
Craig McKinley.
And Deputy Speaker, I'm rather concerned because the honourable member from Brighton Kempton might have a seizure at the end of my speech, but we'll do our best to keep him calm, Deputy Speaker. As we start this, I have the words of the honourable member from Murray ringing in my ears that before, or as this legislation was making its way to the Scotland Parliament, that they received no legal advice that we have received here today in this good form of document. Whether you agree with it or not, it is available for our analysis. But it seems that as this legislation went through the Scottish Parliament, no such advice as to whether Section 35 there are overtones and issues, or whether the Equality Act 2010 had any overtones and issues. Now, I do have issues with the whole concept, but I'm not going to stray into that too much. But on the age of 16, I find this scarcely believable that even in Scotland, a 16-year-old can't drive, a 16-year-old can't buy alcohol, a 16-year-old can't buy cigarettes. Please.
They can vote.
In Scotland, a 16-year-old can vote and they can get married without parental consent. So, and join the armed forces. So I would urge the honourable member to take credence of the actual situation in Scotland.
I was going to cover the things that you can do at 16. I do understand that in education in Scotland, the access of the armed forces to actually encourage a future and a career in the armed forces is actively discouraged, which is taking a lot of people away from what is a credible and superb future employment. But in Scotland, I always like to give the sunbed rule. Can't even go on a sunbed in Scotland, and yet here we are. You can't contract, and yet here we are. We all wanted to do lots of things at age 16, and I will declare to the House I rather wanted a tattoo and an earring at age 16, and here we are at age 56, and I'm damn pleased I didn't go up that route. But what it does mean when I lay on the beach is that most people now sort of point at me and say, look at that, there's a guy without a tattoo on this beach. Now, the other safeguards that I'm concerned about is about sex offenders. I mean, are we really that naive to think those that are so minded will not exploit some of these rules to do things that we know that they will be minded to do? Are we really that naive that we are left to think that people will do the right thing in all circumstances? Now, I am an absolute libertarian conservative. I have no interest how people want to live. That is a matter for them. I have completely no interest, and I don't bring my opinion to this place for legislation. That is not my interest or concern. And I steadfastly do that. People can do exactly as they please. I'd be delighted to.
With him, I do question some of the elements of this bill, in particular why the amendment making clear that anyone going through being charged and trial for sexual offences should be excluded. I think that was madness. But I would just question one point of his argument. What evidence is there that by a man becoming a woman, he somehow has more privileged access to children than he currently does as a man? This is what I cannot understand within the argument.
The Honourable Lady hasn't been here for the whole of the debate. I am getting concerned that people who've been here are not going to be getting. So I am going to say that I will reduce the time limit now to 3 minutes, but I would urge the Honourable Gentleman to bring his remarks to a close, because otherwise he'll have taken a lot more time than...
I thank my right honourable friend. I could go into quite a story, actually, about a nurse, a transsexual woman that was presented to a constituent of mine and the daughter for an intimate examination, but it's a story for another day that I haven't got time to examine here today. But I'm concerned that the potential for obtaining a GRC is much easier and much reduced, rather than what I think has been a well-debated and well-rehearsed and settled argument across the UK up to this date, where living as an appropriate the opposite sex or in a different sex for 2 years, having some medical advice and intervention, and the guarantee and offer that one shall live in that way for the rest of one's days, has been the settled will. I think that's sensible. I'm fully in agreement with that. And as I say, I'm a libertarian conservative, so I really don't mind what people want to do. But this is an issue about Section 35 of the Scotland Act. This changes the Equality Act 2010. It changes the way we live, and I support the government.
Alison Doolis, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to support the right of the Scottish Parliament to legislate and to oppose this government's attempts to override the democratic wishes of our democratically elected Scottish Parliament. We join in Scotland countries like Denmark, Malta, Ireland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Ireland, Switzerland, Argentina, Uruguay and New Zealand in doing this. The UK Government has not acted itself, yet it seeks to deny the Scottish Parliament the right to do this. The very thin statement of reasons that the government has brought forward really is a whole load of supposition, guesswork and nonsense within this. We can't possibly have gender equality. We can't possibly have this legislation in Scotland because HMRC can't fix its systems. We can't possibly have this in Scotland because the UK government is second-guessing the number of people that might actually take it up. We can't possibly have this in Scotland because the very tiny, small, limited number, a handful of private schools that still offer in Scotland single-sex places might have a problem. This is ludicrous nonsense and very, very thin. But what I do want to raise in here particularly is a statement by all of the women's organisations in Scotland who have stated today too much of this debate around this bill has been shaped by misinformation on what the bill will actually mean in practice. The majority of human rights, women's and equalities organisations in Scotland have shown clear, consistent and unified support for this legislation throughout its 7 years in development. And there's a longer statement that is signed by Amnesty International, Close the Gap, Engender, Human Rights Consortium, Just Rights Scotland, National Union of Students Scotland, One Parent Families Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Trade Union Congress, the Scottish Refugee Council, Scottish Women's Aid, Scottish Women's Convention, Scottish Women's Rights Centre, Young Women's Movement and Zero Tolerance. So if the UK government ministers in this place think they know better than these experts with years of experience in dealing with vulnerable women, they really have another thing coming. They should reject their actions today. They should draw back from opposing this bill and they should let the Scottish Government get on with the business of giving trans people the rights they so richly deserve.
Nick Fletcher.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to start where the SNP leader finished off. He's not in his place, sorry about that. Talking about wisdom. I want to ask, where is the wisdom in the removal of the requirement of an applicant to have or have had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria? Where is the wisdom in reducing the minimum age for applicants from 18 to 16? Where is the wisdom in the period for which an applicant must have lived in their acquired gender before submitting an application from 2 years to 3 months? Where is the wisdom in the removal of the requirement for an applicant to provide any evidence that they have lived in their acquired gender when submitting an application? Where is the wisdom in the removal of the requirement for a panel to be satisfied that the applicant meets the criteria? There may have been 6 years of consultation. There may have been many experts who have gone through this, but unfortunately there has been no common sense. The only common sense that I have heard today and the wisdom that I have heard today is for the Secretary of State to use Section 35 to protect women and children in England. I have spoken on this subject before, and I have been vilified for saying transgender children, they are just going through a phase. Only for the NHS to write an article a few weeks later saying the majority of children are going through a phase. This is a toxic subject, and it is now being used by the SNP as a political football. But I want members to remember across this House what this is all about. There are families in this country now where their boys and girls are coming home from school and saying they are in the wrong body. These sorts of things are being glamorised on TV as though it's a wonderful thing. Well, let me tell you, it is tearing parents, families and children apart and setting children on a path of puberty blockers, hormone replacements and then onto surgery. It is a disgrace what we are doing with children and it must stop. I just hope that the parents of those children who come home and have to hear their children go through this show the wisdom and stick fast and hard to their beliefs that they are born, their child was born in the right body, and we should do all we can in this place to protect those parents, protect women and protect children.
Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to make it clear that balancing rights is not a simple task. Balancing rights is complicated and it requires proper attention. We've needed constructive discussion on equality and rights for years, but that has been consistently dismissed and denied. This is entirely the wrong issue for a constitutional clash. It's a matter of public record that I, myself and my party have grave concerns about the format and consequences of this bill, as it has alienated women campaigners and defenders of the rights of women to access single-sex spaces across Scotland. But there are a couple of points I want to make for the Secretary of State's attention. A Section 35 order is absolutely the wrong approach. The Secretary of State said earlier today that the SNP had not objected during the passage of the Scotland Bill to override the clause which has been invoked today. I have to tell him that is simply not the case. Far from the Section 35 override clause being agreed to by the SNP, it was objected to strongly, most of all by my party leader Alex Salmond. It was realised then it would cause the very trouble it is creating now. There are two questions for the Secretary of State, and he must address them. Firstly, if it is inappropriate to use Section 33, will he now publish that legal advice, however exceptional to do so that is? And secondly, why has the Secretary of State not used Schedule 6, Part 1 of the Scotland Act, as that would surely have been a route open to him? That act, the part of the Act states at Schedule 6, Part 1, that in the schedule devolution issues means any other question about whether a function is exercisable within devolved competencies or in as regards Scotland, and any other question arising by virtue of this Act without reserved matters, the matter was not referred to under that schedule. Why? I have no concerns about trans people. My concern is, and always had been, about bad actors. As mentioned earlier today regarding the police case that's been in the press today, predators are determined and devious, and they will go to extraordinary lengths to access their prey. We know that through various reports, not least the behaviour of organisations in the Lambing report about overly optimistic and unrealistic views of predators. 42% of trans-identifying prisoners are on the female estate are sex offenders. That's not representative of the trans community. It's a distortion. So any suggestion that people will not use it for nefarious ends is wrong.
Order. James Daly.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I rise in support of the Government, my honourable friend from Don Valley, and more specifically my honourable friend from Penistone and Stocksbridge, who is one of the most thoughtful, honourable people in this House. Yeah. And the language that has been used against my honourable friend is typical of the language of the left for people with deeply held, honest views. And it is the word disgusting was used across there. It is disgusting that my honourable friend was treated in that way here today.
Yeah. Remove the whip from him.
Now, I think this, in general, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been a good debate. We have had the normal debate every single time I'm in this chamber listening to my honourable friends from the SNP. No matter what the debate, we come back to independence, one version of it or another. And when we look at the title of this debate here, there's two things to talk about. The first is, as it says up there, Section 35 power. Now, the question therefore legally, constitutionally, is are the government entitled constitutionally to use that power to intervene on this decision of the Scottish Government? And clearly they are. There is simply no argument against that. The Equalities Act of 2010 is the legislation within the United Kingdom that guarantees equal human rights, equal rights for everyone, no matter where you live in the United Kingdom. This piece of legislation from the Scottish National Party amends the 2004 Act, the Gender Recognition Act, and that brings it in to the competence of Section 35 because, as has been said previously, the Secretary of State is entitled, if there are adverse effects of this legislation and the impacts of the operation of the Equality Act that result from the fact that the GRC changes a person's protected characteristics of sex for the purpose of the 2010 Act. So that clearly does. There is a legal basis to what the government. So if we go away from that, constitutionally, the government are entitled to do this. We can have a debate regarding what are the merits of one argument or the other, but the government are entitled to do this. They are the elected government of the United Kingdom. We talk, and I know my friends from the SNP would prefer us not to talk like this. We are the United Kingdom, and legislation, like the Equalities Act 2010, applies to us all. Now, in terms of the issues that we're talking about here, because of the competences, because of the Section 35, it brings within the scope that people, members such as me, from English constituencies, can speak in respect of this. And I believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm sure I'm waiting for somebody from the Labour Party to call me transphobic or something, I believe that 16 is too young for these decisions to be made. I believe that this legislation is a direct threat to women's rights, sex and health-based rights, and especially single-sex spaces. Now, those are genuinely held beliefs, so the government are entitled to do this. The government share my beliefs, and they are entirely correct in what they are doing today.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a policy statement, not a legal document, and one so thin that it's absolutely translucent for such an unprecedented unilateral action in invoking the Section 35 powers. And frankly, I've been disgusted by a lot of the tone of the debate today. There are a lot of people who I'm very interested to hear suddenly become massive defenders of equality, including the Honourable Member from Don Valley, who I remember being in a Westminster Hall debate with when he said that Doctor Who, being a woman, was turning boys gay, among other ridiculous arguments.
Give way.
Please.
Will you give way?
That is not.
I won't give way, actually. I think we've had more than enough. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I will not withdraw it.
No. The honourable gentleman must resume his seat. Must resume his seat. If he wants to say a point of order, he can make a point of order.
Point of order, Madam Speaker.
Point of order, Nick Fletcher.
Honourable Member to withdraw that and refer to answer. That is not what I said. That is an outright lie.
No. The honourable gentleman must qualify that. I think he meant she may have unintentionally misled the House. Is that what he is going to say? I hope it is.
Yes, it is, Madam Speaker.
It is. And I hope, with regard to the point of order, which obviously he was addressing to me, to say that he felt, on a point of order, that what had been said was incorrect. My response to that is that if the honourable lady at any point feels that what she has said, when she goes back to look at the debate, has unintentionally misled the House, that she will correct the record. And I'm taking her word for it that she will do that. Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And on checking Hansard, the honourable member actually said that Doctor Who, being a woman, was turning boys towards a life of crime. So clearly it was a matter of misogyny rather than homophobia. However, I am very sorry for having inadvertently misled the House in accusing the member in a very legitimate comment that I made about his brand new respect for our equality legislation, in having made a remark that was misogynist rather than, in fact, homophobic. So I apologise for that omission. I will not give way. We've heard more than enough from the honourable member today. What I would like to talk about is the substance of this piece of paper, because, frankly, it is an absolute joke. I will declare an interest as an LGBT woman, as someone who is myself LGBT and exists, something that's been forgotten entirely in this debate by people that are trying to draw a false distinction between the rights of women and the rights of LGBT people, including trans people. I'm afraid that I don't have the time that I would like to go through all of the clauses in here, which, as I said, are so flimsy as to be ridiculous, including Clause 20, which I'm calling the computer says no clause, which, as the Shadow Minister referred to earlier, says that the law can't be changed because the computer system couldn't handle it. The computer system should be changed to abide by the law, not the other way around. These adverse potential impacts are flimsy. This piece of paper is an absolute nonsense, and as I said, there is just no justification whatsoever for such an unprecedented action in invoking Section 35.
Mr. Blackman. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to start with an apology to all of those trans people in Scotland who had the hope that they were going to be able to get the gender recognition certificate that they can't currently get because they cannot provide thousands of pages of evidence, because they cannot go in front of a panel, because they cannot get a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which the WHO has said should not be necessary in order for a gender recognition certificate. I want to apologise that we've given them that hope, and the UK Government has again dashed that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are a room full of cis people talking about the lives of trans people. That is what we are doing in this room. We are talking about the lives of other people. We're talking about rights that do not affect us in the privileged, entitled position that we have here. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to know why the UK Government has suddenly decided that it's going to try and protect vulnerable women and children. Suddenly it's decided this. It didn't think this when it was talking about the rape clause and implementing that. It didn't think this when it was demonising migrants and refugees. It didn't want to protect women and children until today, when it seems like they can suddenly use this wedge issue to attack trans people, to demonise the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government for the decision that we have taken, the decisions that we have taken in Scotland to try to improve the lives of our trans constituents. Madam Deputy Speaker, I asked the Secretary of State earlier, I asked him what a gender recognition certificate does. He did not have the faintest clue what a gender recognition certificate does, yet he has got the power to veto this legislation from the Scottish Parliament. I have looked at the Statement of Reasons, and it has no reasons that have any impact on the lives of women and girls who are not trans. It does not have any impact on the lives, because it is a manufactured grievance. The Labour Party is absolutely correct. It's a manufactured grievance by the Conservatives. They are cynically using the lives of trans people to create this conflict. A gender recognition certificate does not allow you access to bathrooms. It does not allow you access to changing rooms. It does not allow you to change your passport or driving licence. You can do that without a gender recognition certificate. All it does is allow you to live and die in dignity. It allows you to have the correct gender on your death certificate. It allows you to have pension providers recognise your gender. It is something that trans people need and cannot currently access because of the massive barriers put up in the current Act. Devastated that people over there are suggesting that we should roll back on the current Act even. What we should be doing is making life better for people and improving human rights, not dismantling them. Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First and foremost, this is an attack in devolution. This is an attack in the elected members of Scottish Parliament. And it's an attack made by a Scottish Secretary who's never actually respected the institution of the Scottish Parliament in the first place. He's always thought Westminster was more important, always thought Westminster had primacy over the Scottish Parliament. Now, it's the same Scottish Secretary that tells us we've got the most powerful devolved Parliament in the world. We don't even have the most powerful devolved Parliament in the UK. The Northern Ireland Assembly's got much greater powers than Scotland, including pensions and rights over the Union, to name but two. And then, Madam Deputy Speaker, when you listen to the arguments in here today, the right-wing Tories standing up pretending to speak for women's rights. Right-wing Tories that are part of a culture war. Right-wing Tories that then have the cheek to say that we're manufacturing a constitutional debate. How can us manufacture a constitutional debate when 2/3 of the Scottish parliamentarians elected to the Scottish Parliament voted for the GRR? I can't give way, we don't have enough time. So it's absolutely grievance politics and a culture war from the Tories. And then we get the clutching at straws reason of statement. Now, somebody tried to say this is legal advice. It's not legal advice. Everybody knows if you pay a lawyer, you can get a lawyer to write what you want. And that's what this is, a list of bogus reasons to come up for reasons for the Scottish Secretary to introduce a section 35. Now let's look at the equal pay section. It's unbelievable. It's saying transgender people are going to cause problems with equal pay, because if somebody transgenders from becomes a transgender woman, then they might have been in higher pay before, and that's going to affect the claims. They're also saying somebody actually transitioning could affect the claim of somebody else's equal pay claim, because they can't use that person as a benchmark. If you're talking manufactured grievance, you can't make that up. In actual fact, that must happen just now when people have already got a GRC certificate. So if it doesn't undermine equal pay settlements just now, how can the GRR undermine equal pay settlement? Now, the bottom line is, you know if you're on the right side of the argument when the opposite side of that lot there. Comparing trans people to predators, it's an utter disgrace. And Monofemo's already did it. But you know on your right side of the argument, when Amnesty International closed the gap in gender, Human Rights Consortium, Just Right Scotland, NUS Scotland, One Parent Family Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Trade Unions Congress, Scottish Refugee Council, Scottish Women's Aid, Scottish Women's Convention, Scottish Women's Rights Centre, Young Women's Movement and Zero Tolerance on the same side as us.
The question is that this House has considered the Government's decision to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act with regard to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. Aye. Clear the lobby. The question is that this House has considered the Government's decision to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act with regard to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tellers for the aye, Stuart Anderson and Mike Wood. Tellers for the noes, Peter Grant and Stephen Bonnard. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 318. The noes to the left, 71.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 318. The noes to the left, 71. So the ayes have it, unlocked. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.